the purpose of this book. We must ask ourselves if the human race has reached a pivotal threshold, a moment where a profound internal blossoming is truly possible. Imagine a shift so staggering that the majestic blooming of the natural world pales in comparison. We are challenged to consider whether the heavy, rigid frameworks of our conditioned thinking can be shed. Is it possible for us to become translucent to the radiant illumination of pure awareness, much like a dense rock transforming into a flawless light-bearing crystal? This requires us to resist the heavy gravitational drag of our materialistic fixations. It demands that we elevate ourselves beyond our deep-seated attachment to physical form, the very attachment that anchors the false sense of self and traps us within the narrow confines of our own constructed personalities. For millennia, the potential for such an extraordinary metamorphosis has echoed through the core teachings of the world's greatest spiritual traditions. History's most revered messengers, figures such as Jesus, the Buddha, and countless unnamed sages, were essentially the earliest blossoms of this human awakening. They were magnificent, yet isolated anomalies. During their respective eras, a collective, widespread awakening was simply not viable. As a result, their profound insights were frequently misunderstood, heavily filtered, and deeply warped over the centuries. Their teachings did little to fundamentally alter the trajectory of human behavior, taking root only within a minuscule fraction of the population. This brings us to a vital inquiry. Is our current civilization more prepared for this leap than those ancient societies were? If so, what underlying factors make this the right moment? Furthermore, what conscious actions, if any, can we undertake to manifest or hasten this internal revolution? We must deeply investigate the hallmarks of the archaic, ego-driven state of awareness, contrasting them with the recognizable indicators of a newly blooming consciousness. These fundamental mysteries form the bedrock of our exploration. Yet, the significance of this work extends far beyond the mere intellectual answering of questions. The text before you is designed as an active catalyst for transformation, born directly from the very consciousness it seeks to describe. The philosophies and mental constructs explored herein hold value, but they are ultimately subservient to a grander function. They act as mere directional markers, guiding the traveler toward a state of true wakefulness. The very act of engaging with these words is intended to ignite a palpable internal shift. The objective here is not to cram your intellect with novel data, construct new belief systems, or persuade you to adopt a specific ideology. The singular aim is to facilitate an absolute alteration in your state of being, to catalyze your awakening. In a conventional sense, this endeavor is not meant to be merely entertaining or intellectually stimulating. To find something interesting implies a safe, detached engagement, a space where you can playfully debate concepts and simply agree or disagree without any personal stake. Instead, this journey is intimately and entirely about you. It will either fundamentally restructure your awareness, or it will resonate as utterly devoid of meaning. It holds the power to awaken only those who harbor a genuine readiness. While the entirety of the global population has not yet reached this stage of preparedness, a critical mass is rapidly forming. With every single individual who steps into the light of awareness, the momentum within our shared collective consciousness surges, paving a smoother path for those who follow. If the concept of awakening remains abstract or elusive, simply continue onward. The true definition of the word can only be comprehended through the direct, lived experience of it. A solitary, fleeting glimpse of this truth is entirely sufficient to trigger a process that cannot be undone. For some, this pivotal spark will ignite during their journey through these very reflections. For countless others, the wheels of transformation have already been set into motion, perhaps entirely beneath their conscious radar. This exploration will serve to illuminate and validate that unseen progression. This internal shift may have been violently awakened by the sharp sting of profound loss or intense suffering. Alternatively, it might have been gently coaxed into existence through an encounter with a profound spiritual mentor, or by immersing oneself in spiritually vibrant, transformative literature. If the seeds of awakening have already taken root within you, engaging with these insights will serve to dramatically accelerate and deepen your evolution. A crucial, inescapable component of stepping into awareness involves a stark confrontation with the unawakened facets of your own being. It requires shining a light on the ego, observing how it manipulates your thoughts, dictates your speech, and drives your actions. It also necessitates a clear-eyed recognition of the deeply ingrained collective mental habits that continuously breathe life into our shared state of spiritual slumber. By exposing the primary characteristics of the ego and mapping its operational tactics on both a personal and a societal level, we achieve two vital objectives. First, an intimate knowledge of the ego's hidden mechanics is your only defense against its relentless deception. Without this understanding, it will perpetually trick you into merging your identity with its own, operating as a shadowy imposter masquerading as your true self. Second, the very practice of recognizing these unconscious patterns is, paradoxically, a primary vehicle for the awakening itself. In the precise moment you identify the shadows of unawareness within, the entity doing the recognizing is the newly arisen consciousness. You are actively awakening. It is a futile endeavor to engage in open warfare against the ego, much like attempting to punch the darkness to make it disappear. The only requirement is the introduction of illumination, and you, in your truest essence, are that very light. Chapter 1. Chapter 1. The Flowering of Human Consciousness. Picture our world over 100 million years in the past, in the quiet light of a prehistoric dawn. The planet's surface has long been blanketed by lush, primordial greenery, a vast ocean of plant life existing merely to survive and propagate. Yet, on this particular morning, a monumental evolutionary leap occurs. The very first blossom unfurls its petals to the warming sun. For epochs, such delicate manifestations were likely sparse and fragile, unable to take a firm hold. But inevitably, a critical tipping point was crossed. Imagine an unseen observer witnessing an abrupt, magnificent eruption of vivid hues and sweet fragrances sweeping across the globe. Millennia later, these delicate, aromatic entities would weave themselves intimately into the developing awareness of another emerging species, humanity. As our ancestors' consciousness expanded, flowers likely became the very first objects valued not for their utility, not for sustenance or shelter, but purely for their intrinsic beauty. They sparked a wellspring of inspiration that would eventually nourish poets, artists, and spiritual seekers across all ages. We see this reverence echoed in the teachings of great masters. We are invited to observe the lilies to understand the art of simply being, or we recall the legendary moment when the Buddha delivered a profound sermon without uttering a single syllable. He simply held up a flower and gazed at it. Among the silent crowd, only one monk smiled in deep, resonant understanding, a moment of transmitted realization that would eventually blossom into the Zen tradition. Recognizing the exquisite beauty of a blossom was a watershed moment in human evolution. It was an awakening, however fleeting, to the sacred, formless essence that resides within our own deepest selves. Joy and love are inextricably woven into this recognition of beauty. Even without conscious realization, these ethereal, short-lived blooms became tangible symbols of our own highest, most sacred nature. We might even consider the blooming of a flower as the enlightenment of the plant kingdom. This leap into a higher, less dense state of being is not restricted to plants. In the mineral world, certain dense rocks undergo immense pressure to become luminous crystals or brilliant diamonds, allowing light to pass through what was once impenetrable. Similarly, the heaviest, most earth-bound reptiles eventually evolved feathers, defied gravity, and took to the skies as birds. They did not merely improve their crawling, they transcended it entirely. Throughout human history, these ethereal manifestations, flowers, gems, and birds, have captivated our spirits because they are slightly less burdened by the density of matter. They whisper of the formless, unified consciousness that underlies all creation. When our perception is imbued with a quiet, alert presence, we can sense this divine spark in every living thing. Until that presence awakens, we remain fixated on the external shell of the world, just as we remain trapped within the superficial layer of our own physical and psychological identities. However, the delicate nature of a blossom, a crystal, or even a newborn creature, be it a human infant or a frail animal, allows the underlying light of spirit to shine through more readily. Their lack of hardened materiality invites us into a space of innocence and wonder. When we gaze upon them without rushing to attach mental labels, they serve as transparent windows into the infinite. This is why such enlightened life forms have been central to our spiritual symbolism, like the lotus in the east or the dove in the west. They have been gently preparing the fertile ground of our collective psyche for a much more profound evolutionary leap, the very spiritual awakening we are beginning to experience today. When we peer deeply into the core of the world's ancient wisdom traditions, looking past the superficial variations in dogma and ritual, we uncover a remarkable consensus around two fundamental truths. The first is a sobering diagnosis of the human condition, the recognition that our ordinary everyday state of consciousness is deeply flawed, colored by a pervasive dysfunction that borders on collective insanity. In the profound traditions of India, this condition is referred to as Maya, a thick veil of psychological delusion. The Buddha articulated this by teaching that the unobserved human mind inherently generates suffering, a continuous undercurrent of dissatisfaction and misery that inevitably surfaces in every aspect of our lives. Similarly, early Christian teachings point to this inherited flaw through the concept of original sin. Stripped of its modern moralistic baggage and understood through its ancient linguistic roots, to sin simply means to miss the mark, to live blindly and unskillfully, thereby inflicting pain upon oneself and the world. We cannot deny the staggering brilliance of the human mind. Our achievements in art, music, architecture, and more recently, the breathtaking leaps in science and technology are nothing short of miraculous. Yet, this formidable intelligence is severely compromised by a fatal flaw. Our technological advancements have merely amplified the destructive consequences of our collective madness, weaponizing our dysfunction against the planet, its creatures, and ourselves. The 20th century stands as a grim testament to this magnified insanity. Despite our intellectual prowess, we utilized our brilliance to engineer instruments of unimaginable slaughter. Millions perished in brutal trench warfare, and tens of millions more were systematically annihilated in genocides and ideological purges driven by fear, greed, and a thirst for dominance. A clinical assessment of human history would undoubtedly diagnose our species with chronic paranoid delusions and a pathological compulsion for cruelty and violence. We project our own unacknowledged inner darkness outward, perceiving enemies everywhere. This same toxic triad of fear, greed, and the lust for power fuels not only global conflicts, but the endless friction within our personal relationships. However, it is crucial to understand that these destructive drives are not the root of the illness. They are merely the symptoms of a far deeper structural delusion within the human psyche. Spiritual practices that focus solely on suppressing desire or cultivating moral goodness often fail because they treat the symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. Attempting to construct a utopian society through external ideologies, as seen in the tragic failures of grand political experiments, is doomed from the start if it ignores the inner blueprint for dysfunction that every human carries, the ego. True goodness cannot be manufactured. It can only emerge naturally when a fundamental shift in consciousness allows our inherent, unconditioned essence to shine through. From this grim diagnosis of our inherited dysfunction arises the second exquisitely hopeful truth shared by the great ancient traditions, the promise of a radical, total transformation of human awareness. Whether termed enlightenment, salvation, liberation, or the cessation of suffering, this inner revolution represents the pinnacle of human potential. The greatest triumph of humanity is not found in our towering skyscrapers or our technological marvels, but in our capacity to recognize our own collective madness. Long ago, this profound clarity blossomed in a few extraordinary individuals, such as the awakened sage we know as the Buddha, or the ancient Chinese master Lao Tzu, whose insights gave birth to the timeless wisdom of the Tao Te Ching. To clearly perceive one's own insanity is, in itself, the dawn of true sanity. It marks the first delicate flowering of a new dimension of consciousness on our planet. These early pioneers attempted to share their vision, pointing out the self-created suffering of their contemporaries and illuminating a path out of the collective nightmare. Yet the world was largely unprepared for their revolutionary message. Inevitably, their simple, potent teachings were misunderstood, diluted, and frequently distorted by those who sought to record or interpret them. As centuries passed, these misinterpretations crystallized into rigid religious structures. Instead of uniting humanity through the realization of our shared underlying essence, religions often became instruments of division, hatred, and warfare. The ego co-opted the sacred, twisting the infinite, unnameable reality of the divine into exclusive mental idols used to justify violence and assert superiority over non-believers. Yet, despite the staggering atrocities committed in the name of the divine, the radiant core of truth within these traditions was never fully extinguished. It continues to pulse beneath the heavy layers of dogma. Throughout history, small lineages of esoteric seekers, the mystics of early Christianity, the Sufis of Islam, the practitioners of Zen and Dzogchen in Buddhism, managed to pierce through the conceptual deadwood. These iconoclastic movements prioritized direct personal realization and inner transformation over blind belief, keeping the transformative fire of the original teachings alive, even when viewed with deep suspicion by established religious hierarchies. In our current era, the distinction between rigid religion and genuine spirituality is becoming increasingly clear to a growing multitude. True spiritual depth has absolutely nothing to do with adhering to a specific set of beliefs or defending a rigid mental doctrine. In fact, the more tightly you weave your identity around a collection of thoughts you claim to be the absolute truth, the more profoundly you sever yourself from your own inner spiritual dimension. Historically, religious institutions, dominated by the egoic mind, felt deeply threatened by true spiritual awakening and actively sought to suppress it, equating spiritual truth with rigid intellectual conformity. Today, however, we are witnessing an unprecedented phenomenon, a massive global flowering of spiritual consciousness occurring largely outside the confines of traditional religious institutions. Simultaneously, a beautiful softening is occurring within the boundaries of some established faiths. Drawing inspiration from ancient Eastern wisdom and contemporary spiritual insights, many individuals within traditional religions are learning to look past the dense outer layers of dogma. They are discovering the profound, formless depth hidden within their own traditions, finding that their capacity for love and connection is dictated by their state of presence, not the specific tenets they claim to believe. Conversely, those who remain blindly identified with religious form are digging their heels in deeper, fortifying their mental positions. We are currently experiencing an intense polarization, an unparalleled influx of awakening consciousness running parallel to a fierce, desperate entrenchment of the ego. Many religious and political organizations operate as massive, collective, egoic entities, fiercely defending their ideological borders. However, the ultimate fate of the ego is dissolution. No matter how monolithic and impenetrable these ossified structures appear, they are destined to crumble from the inside out, much like the sudden, unforeseen collapse of seemingly invincible political empires in our recent past. We must prepare ourselves for many such sudden disintegrations. Throughout the vast history of life on this planet, radical evolutionary leaps have always been precipitated by existential crises. When an organism's established mode of survival is no longer viable, when the environment turns overwhelmingly hostile, the species faces a stark, binary choice: undergo a fundamental transformation or perish. Imagine the first ancient sea creatures compelled by receding waters or a harsh environment, struggling onto the alien terrain of dry land. It was a monumental struggle against gravity and biology, an adaptation born of absolute necessity, eventually leading to lungs replacing gills and limbs replacing fins. Today, humanity stands at a similar, terrifying precipice. The deeply ingrained dysfunction of the egoic mind, a flaw diagnosed millennia ago by ancient sages, has now been amplified to a planetary scale by our technological prowess. For the very first time in our history, the survival of the Earth's ecosystem and our species is acutely threatened by our own behavior. In the past, spiritual awakening was a luxury, a rare flowering achieved by isolated mystics. It did not spread across the population because it was not yet a biological imperative. That era has ended. A rapidly expanding segment of the global population is arriving at a chilling realization: we must evolve, or we will face extinction. We are currently experiencing the painful, chaotic fracturing of the old, ego-dominated mental frameworks and the simultaneous, urgent emergence of an entirely new dimension of awareness. This shift is not the adoption of a new mythology, a fresh ideology, or a better belief system. We are reaching the absolute limits of what thought alone can accomplish. The heart of this new consciousness involves transcending the incessant stream of mental noise. It is the profound liberation of realizing that the relentless voice in your head is not your true identity. If you are not that voice, then who are you? You are the silent, observing presence that bears witness to it. You are the vast, formless space of awareness in which every thought, emotion, and perception unfolds. The ego is simply this, the complete, absolute identification with form, primarily the fleeting forms of human thought. When we are entirely trapped in these forms, we lose all sense of our profound interconnectedness with the web of life and the divine source. This tragic forgetfulness of our fundamental unity is the true essence of original sin and the root cause of all human suffering and cruelty. If this deeply rooted delusion of separateness continues to dictate our actions, we are condemned to endlessly recreate the same cycles of violence, exploitation, and despair. The title of this exploration draws its inspiration from a profound, ancient prophetic vision found in biblical texts, one that resonates with startling relevance in our current epoch. It speaks of the inevitable fracturing of the old world order and the subsequent dawn of a new heaven and a new earth. To comprehend the true depth of this prophecy, we must strip away physical geography. Heaven, in its deepest esoteric meaning, does not refer to a destination in the sky, but to the vast, formless inner realm of consciousness. Earth represents the outer physical manifestation of form. These two realms are inextricably linked. The outer world is always a direct, tangible reflection of our collective inner state. Therefore, a new heaven signifies the emergence of a radically transformed, awakened state of human awareness. Consequently, a new earth is the inevitable physical reflection of that spiritual shift. Because the consciousness of humanity and the living biosphere of the planet are intimately intertwined, the dissolution of the heavy egoic consciousness will inevitably be accompanied by profound disruptions and synchronistic upheavals in the natural world, climatic and geographic fractures that we are already beginning to witness. The birth of the new is always preceded by the turbulent breaking of the old. Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Ego, the current state of humanity. The hypnotic allure of language casts a powerful spell over our perception. Whether spoken aloud or echoing silently within the corridors of the mind as thought, words easily trick us into a false sense of knowing. We hastily attach a vocalized sound or a mental label to a bird, a tree, a stone, or another human being, and in that instant we arrogantly assume we have grasped its totality. In truth, we know nothing of it. The sheer mystery of existence has merely been concealed beneath a superficial tag. Every element of the cosmos possesses an unfathomable depth, an intrinsic pulsing connection to the limitless source from which all life springs. Our everyday perception barely grazes the surface of this reality, perceiving less than the very tip of the iceberg. Yet, if we can simply observe a flower or hold a stone without the immediate compulsion to name it or judge it, a profound reverence awakens. Its silent, formless essence communes with our own. This is the secret language of the great artists, who do not merely look at a mundane object and dismiss it with a noun, but gaze deeply into its very beingness until its life force translates onto the canvas. When we strip away the relentless, deadening cataloguing of the mind, the miraculous vibrancy of the world, long buried under mental abstraction, is suddenly resurrected. The ultimate miracle, however, is encountering our own essential nature, a state of being that precedes all language, labels, and imagery. This requires the painstaking untangling of the pure I, the naked sense of existence, from the myriad of forms and concepts it has mistakenly woven itself into. The single syllable I carries within it both the most profound truth of our existence and the most devastating foundational error. In our daily vernacular, it is relentlessly deployed alongside its companions me, my, and mine, yet it is fundamentally deceptive. When used conventionally, it encapsulates a monumental optical illusion of consciousness, an entirely fabricated sense of identity that we call the ego. This phantom self dictates our interactions, warps our interpretations of reality, and constructs a world that merely mirrors its own original illusion. Yet there is a liberating truth. An illusion cannot survive being seen. The moment you recognize the false as false, it begins to dissolve. So, what exactly comprises this counterfeit self? It begins in infancy when a child associates a specific sequence of vocal sounds, their name, with their very existence. Soon, the magical concept of I is acquired and fused with this name. Gradually, this central thought acts as a magnet, attracting and absorbing other concepts. The I claims objects, transforming them into mine. A broken toy elicits agonizing despair, not because the plastic holds intrinsic worth, but because the concept of mine has deeply embedded the object into the child's fragile, developing identity. As the years pass, this core thought becomes encrusted with countless identifications: gender, nationality, religion, profession, social roles, and the heavy, repetitive narrative of personal history. The I you speak of is rarely your true essence. It is an elaborate mental construct, a precarious bundle of thoughts held together solely by your unconscious belief that they constitute who you are. To be spiritually asleep is to be entirely submerged in this relentless, compulsive stream of thought, mistaking the ceaseless voice in the head for your own soul. This realization often strikes in the most mundane of circumstances. Consider the experience of witnessing someone visibly consumed by an internal dialogue, speaking aloud in an agitated tone to phantom adversaries on a crowded train, entirely disconnected from their physical surroundings. We might view such a person with alarm, categorizing them as insane, yet the shocking truth reveals itself when we turn the mirror inward. The only meaningful distinction between the individual ranting aloud and the vast majority of humanity is the volume of the voice. Our own minds are equally hyperactive, constantly defending, accusing, arguing, and projecting past grievances into the present. The underlying current might be generalized anxiety rather than overt anger, but the frantic involuntary machinery of the mind operates identically. We are all bound by this collective madness to varying degrees. Seeing this clearly, even for a fleeting moment, offers a profound shift in perspective. We step back and observe the mind rather than being trapped within it. It is a moment of profound sanity, a detachment that allows us to laugh at the agonizing seriousness with which the ego views its own manufactured dilemmas. The intellect, long worshipped as the pinnacle of human achievement and the ultimate temple of knowledge, is exposed not as our savior, but, when unobserved, as the primary source of our existential dilemma. The egoic mechanism is entirely bound by the past, functioning through a dual framework of content and structure. The specific toy a child cries over represents interchangeable content. It is shaped entirely by culture, wealth, and environment. The profound suffering, however, is structural, rooted in the unconscious compulsion to seek identity through association. The word identification literally means to make the same. We endow an external object or concept with a sense of self, desperately attempting to find our reflection in it, only to inevitably lose ourselves in the process. This structural flaw is ruthlessly exploited by the machinery of consumerism. Advertising does not sell mere objects, it sells identity enhancers. We are convinced that purchasing a specific brand or designer label will somehow elevate our status, make us stand out, and incrementally add to our hollow sense of self. We buy into collective identities, mistaking the accumulation of possessions for the accumulation of being. While the physical world of things is a necessary aspect of our human experience, to be respected and utilized, it becomes a disease when we use it as a crutch for self-enhancement. This unchecked obsession mirrors a cancerous growth driven by an insatiable, blind demand for endless multiplication, unaware that it is destroying the very organism of which it is a part. We must honestly examine our relationship with our possessions. Do we feel a subtle wave of superiority over those who have less? Do we flaunt our acquisitions to elevate our worth in the mirroring gaze of others? Do we feel a painful diminishment of self when a prized possession is lost? When faced with the imminent loss of all worldly things, such as in the shadow of terminal illness, the absolute futility of finding oneself in objects is laid bare. A cherished heirloom, when stolen or lost, triggers intense anger and defensiveness, not because of the physical object itself, but because the ego mistakenly believes a fragment of its I am has been taken away. It is only when we fully accept the loss, when we surrender the internal resistance, that the radiant joy of being, previously obscured by the mental concept of the object, surges forth. Letting go becomes an act of transcendent power. proving that who we truly are cannot be diminished by the shifting tides of the material world. The very concept of ownership is a collective fiction. Asserting that a towering skyscraper or a vast tract of land belongs to you is merely a story, validated only by societal agreement and signed papers. When death approaches, this narrative crumbles into utter meaninglessness. To be poor in spirit, as the ancient teachings suggest, is to be unburdened by these identifications, free from the mental baggage of ownership and conceptual self-definition, and thus open to the profound joy of existence. Yet, renouncing possessions is not an automatic cure. The ego is highly adaptable. Strip away its material wealth, and it will quickly construct a new, superior identity as a spiritual ascetic, feeding off the pride of its own renunciation. The structure of identification remains perfectly intact, even as the content shifts. The ego thrives on comparison, constantly evaluating its worth through the eyes of others. Because satisfaction derived from having is excruciatingly brief, the ego's survival depends on the structural compulsion of wanting. It wants to want far more than it actually wants to have. This addictive, insatiable hunger for more leaves a perpetual void, a gnawing sense of insufficiency. Whether it manifests as an individual's relentless, unfulfilled ambition or a massive corporation's ruthless pursuit of endless profit, the underlying energy is identical, a blind, destructive craving that sacrifices humanity, nature, and inner peace upon the altar of accumulation. Beyond material objects, the ego anchors itself heavily in the physical vehicle. Gender roles dictate behavior from infancy, trapping individuals in restrictive, conditioned patterns that they mistake for their ultimate purpose. In the modern world, we base a terrifying amount of our self-worth on the body's strength, fitness, and aesthetic appeal. The inevitable fading of youth and beauty becomes a source of profound suffering because the very foundation of the ego's identity is collapsing. Even perceived flaws or illnesses are rapidly co-opted by the ego. An individual can construct an entire identity around being a sufferer or a patient, unconsciously clinging to the ailment because it provides a definitive sense of self and extracts validation and attention from the world. True freedom from this physical identification is not found by neglecting or despising the body, but by shifting our focus inward. By moving our attention away from the external appearance and the mind's endless judgments about it, we connect with the vibrant, pulsing field of life energy within. Feeling this inner aliveness anchors us fiercely in the present moment, dissolving our identification with the temporal form and opening a gateway to the eternal, formless essence of our being. The ego, fundamentally, is the tragic forgetfulness of this being. It is the entanglement of our pure, spacious consciousness with form, not just physical forms, but the dense, subtle forms of thought and emotion. When we are entirely consumed by the incessant voice in our head, we are spiritually unconscious, trapped in a self-generated nightmare of absolute separateness.
The philosopher Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," mistakenly equating the ceaseless machinery of thought with the absolute truth of existence. He unwittingly articulated the very root of the egoic delusion. It was not until much later that the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre recognized the profound implication hidden within this statement. The consciousness that observes the thinking cannot be the thinking itself. When you are aware that you are lost in thought, a new dimension of awareness has emerged. You are no longer the sleepwalker completely identified with the dream. You are the awakened presence observing the dreamer. This emergence of the observing consciousness often occurs in the crucible of absolute devastation. When individuals face extreme limit situations, the sudden, catastrophic loss of everything that previously defined them, from possessions and status to physical abilities and loved ones, the entire scaffolding of the ego collapses. In the void left by this collapse, if they do not immediately construct a new conceptual identity, as a bitter victim of an unjust fate, an inexplicable, profound serenity arises. This is the peace that defies all logical comprehension. When every form you have clung to is violently stripped away, Your true nature is released from its material prison. You discover your essential identity not as a collection of external attributes or mental stories, but as the all-pervasive, radiant light of consciousness itself. In the face of tragedy, yielding and total inner surrender shatter the hardened, resistive shell of the ego, inviting a transcendent, unconditioned intelligence to flow through you, aligning your very presence with the creative power of the entire universe. Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Core of Ego. Most individuals are entirely consumed by the ceaseless chatter inside their own heads, an involuntary cascade of thoughts and accompanying emotions. When this state goes unrecognized, one mistakenly believes this internal narrator is their true identity. This is the essence of the egoic mind. It is termed egoic because every memory, judgment, and emotional reaction is imbued with a false sense of I. To live in this manner is to exist in profound spiritual slumber. The mind's contents are invariably products of past conditioning, shaped by culture, upbringing, and environment. At the very center of this cognitive activity lies a cluster of repetitive thoughts and reactive habits that one fiercely identifies with. This core entity is the ego itself. When a person uses the word I, it is rarely the true self speaking. It is this ego. It is a fragile assemblage of memories forming a personal narrative, unconscious social roles, and collective allegiances to nations, religions, or classes. It clings to possessions, physical appearance, and deeply held resentments, constantly measuring itself as superior or inferior to others. While the specific details of egos vary wildly across humanity, their underlying architecture is identical. They are sustained exclusively through two mechanisms, identification and separation. Because the thought forms and emotions that comprise the ego are inherently ephemeral, the ego exists in a perpetual state of existential dread, constantly fighting to survive, expand, and protect its boundaries. To maintain the illusion of I, it absolutely requires the existence of an other. This other becomes most distinctly separate when perceived as an adversary. This fundamental structural need manifests on a spectrum, from the subtle compulsive habit of finding fault with neighbors to the catastrophic violence of global warfare. When we criticize or condemn, we unconsciously inflate our own sense of self-importance. One of the most effective strategies the ego employs to fortify its boundaries is the act of complaining. Every grievance voiced is a miniature narrative fabricated by the mind, swallowed whole and believed completely. It makes little difference whether these complaints are vocalized or merely echo silently within. For certain egos, lacking other substantial identifications, the act of complaining serves as their primary life force. When caught in this pattern, habitually assigning negative labels to others, whether to their faces, behind their backs, or in the privacy of one's own thoughts, becomes second nature. Name-calling represents the most primitive manifestation of this need to triumph over another, deploying definitive, insulting pronouncements that brook no argument. Just beneath this lies the realm of screaming and physical aggression. Accompanying this habit of complaining is the potent emotion of resentment. To resent is to harbor bitterness, to feel deeply offended by the actions, inactions, or perceived greed and dishonesty of others. The ego revels in this state. Instead of recognizing the unconscious behavior of another as a universal human flaw, the ego personalizes it, transforming that flaw into the individual's entire identity. In truth, it is the observer's own unconsciousness doing the labeling. Often the perceived slight is an absolute fabrication, a projection of a mind desperate to invent enemies and establish its own moral high ground. By fixating on a genuine fault in another, we simultaneously amplify that same trait within ourselves. Consequently, refusing to react to the ego in others is a profoundly powerful practice. It dissolves the ego within oneself and chips away at the collective human dysfunction. This non-reaction is only possible when we understand that abrasive behavior is merely an expression of the ego, entirely impersonal. Without personalizing the encounter, the compulsion to defend or attack vanishes. This non-reaction, far from being a weakness, is the essence of true forgiveness. It is the ability to look past the dense outer layer of the ego and recognize the inherent sanity and pure essence residing within every human being. The ego applies this same mechanism to situations, turning circumstances into enemies by insisting that what is happening should not be happening. The ultimate adversary of the ego is, therefore, the present moment itself. Complaining must be distinguished from the practical communication of a mistake to rectify a situation. Stating facts neutrally, such as informing a waiter that a bowl of soup is cold, contains no ego. However, taking the cold soup as a personal insult, adopting an attitude of "how dare you," feeds the me that delights in being offended. If we cultivate the awareness to catch the voice in our head the moment it begins to complain, we recognize it merely as a conditioned habit. In that instant of recognition, we detach from the voice and become the silent observer of it, stepping out of the ego's grip. When resentment is infused with volatile emotions like anger, the ego's energetic charge multiplies exponentially. Complaining escalates into outright reactivity. Many individuals move through their days in a state of suspended anticipation, waiting for the next trigger to feel outraged or disturbed. They are addicted to the surge of indignation just as surely as one might be to a chemical substance. By pushing against the world, they continuously reaffirm their own existence. A grievance is a resentment that has been nurtured and sustained over time. To carry a grievance is to exist in a perpetual state of opposition, which is why historical collective grievances can poison the psyches of entire nations for centuries, fueling endless cycles of retaliation. At its core, a grievance is a negative emotional response locked to a past event, artificially kept alive by the mind's relentless retelling of the story. This toxic energy invariably bleeds into other aspects of life, distorting present perceptions and poisoning current relationships. A single deeply held grievance is sufficient to keep an individual entirely trapped within the egoic mind. It demands rigorous honesty to examine oneself for these lingering enemies. The process of forgiveness cannot be forced. Attempting to simply let go is a futile exercise. True release occurs spontaneously when one clearly sees that the grievance serves absolutely no purpose other than to artificially inflate a false sense of identity. To see the mechanism is to be freed from it. The past possesses no inherent power to prevent us from experiencing the present moment. Only our active grievance about the past wields that power. The act of fault-finding bolsters the ego's necessary illusion of separateness. However, it also nourishes the ego through a secondary mechanism, the intoxicating feeling of superiority. When one complains about traffic, political figures, or the habits of an ex-spouse, an unspoken implication arises. The complainer is inherently right, and the subject of the complaint is fundamentally wrong. Nothing fortifies the ego quite like the conviction of being right. It represents complete identification with a specific mental stance, a rigid perspective. Naturally, to occupy the position of right, another must be designated as wrong. The ego actively seeks out opportunities to assign blame and incorrectness, because this dynamic instantly positions the individual on an imagined platform of moral superiority. It is this very sensation of being superior that the ego hungers for and uses to build its strength. In the realm of objective facts, one person can indeed be correct while another is mistaken. Observing that lightning flashes before thunder rumbles confirms a scientific truth. Stating such a fact does not inherently involve the ego, provided there is no identification with the mental position. However, the moment a defensive tone enters the conversation, the desperate plea of "why won't you believe me?" the ego has infiltrated the exchange. The simple statement of fact has been personalized, weaponized to protect a fragile sense of me that feels diminished by another's disbelief. In these instances, one is no longer defending truth. Truth requires no defense from human minds. Instead, the individual is fiercely protecting the illusion of their own identity. If even verifiable facts can be distorted by egoic attachment, the vast, subjective landscapes of opinions and viewpoints are entirely susceptible to this contamination. The ego routinely mistakes its own perspectives for absolute facts, completely incapable of separating an external event from its own emotional reaction to it. Only the clear light of awareness can untangle a factual situation from the anger or frustration it triggers, revealing a multitude of alternative perspectives that the ego's narrow vision simply cannot process. When we step beyond simple verifiable phenomena, the rigid certainty that "I am right and you are wrong" becomes exceptionally dangerous, poisoning both intimate relationships and international diplomacy. If this dynamic is a mental illness that breeds conflict, does it follow that no moral compass exists, that all behavior is relative? History provides terrifying examples of how the absolute conviction of possessing the truth has justified unspeakable atrocities. From the brutal inquisitions of religious institutions to the horrific purges enacted by ideological dictators, millions have been slaughtered because their mere existence conflicted with a dominant narrative, a narrative that was ultimately just a bundle of thoughts. The condemnation of moral relativism by established institutions is not entirely unfounded, but the fatal error lies in searching for absolute truth within doctrines, scriptures, or ideological frameworks. All such structures are constructed from thought, and thought can only serve as a signpost pointing toward truth. It can never be the truth itself. The finger pointing at the moon is not the celestial body. Religions can be powerful tools for spiritual liberation when used as maps left by awakened masters, but they become toxic when hijacked by the ego to create division and false superiority. The singular, absolute truth from which all other truths emanate is inseparable from one's own being. It is the unconditioned I am, the essence of life itself, known in various traditions as the Christ within or the Buddha nature. When an individual aligns with this innermost dimension, their actions naturally reflect a profound interconnectedness and love. Rules and commandments are necessary constraints only for those severed from this inner reality. As St. Augustine profoundly stated, "Love and do what you will." This us versus them mentality is most deeply crystallized in regions plagued by enduring endemic conflict. Both factions become hopelessly entangled in their own specific narratives, utterly incapable of acknowledging the potential validity of an opposing perspective. Both claim absolute victimhood, both dehumanize the other into an absolute evil. This conceptualization allows for the infliction of horrific violence without a shred of empathetic resonance. The collective ego, operating as an unquestioning us, demonstrates a capacity for insanity far exceeding that of the individual ego. The vast majority of historical atrocities were not perpetrated by clinical sociopaths, but by ordinary citizens obediently serving a collective madness. When we observe cruelty, greed, or selfishness, our instinct is to personalize it, to define the perpetrator entirely by these destructive traits. Yet, confusing the egoic behavior of another with their true identity is merely a ploy of our own ego to assert moral dominance. The very behaviors that trigger the most intense reactions within us are almost always reflections of our own unacknowledged egoic patterns. We have much to learn from those we deem enemies. The traits we find repulsive are simply manifestations of a universal human dysfunction. They are entirely impersonal. Only when we mistakenly identify these patterns as our own true self does the observation become threatening. While practical action is sometimes necessary to prevent harm, embarking on a crusade to eradicate perceived evil invariably transforms the crusader into a reflection of the enemy. Engaging unconsciousness with forceful opposition only breeds deeper unconsciousness. The very act of fighting strengthens the adversary. Modern declarations of war against abstract concepts, drugs, crime, poverty, or disease are fundamentally flawed paradigms. The war on crime has coincided with exploding prison populations. The militarized approach to medicine has birthed antibiotic-resistant superbugs. War is a cognitive framework, a lens through which perception becomes radically distorted and fiercely selective. It is a delusional system that ensures the perpetuation of conflict. When we recognize the ego as a collective illness rather than a personal failing, the compulsion to react, blame, and condemn evaporates. Compassion naturally arises as we witness the universal suffering inflicted by this mental sickness. We cease adding fuel to the dramatic fires upon which the ego thrives. Everyone claims to desire peace. Yet, residing within the unobserved mind is a powerful entity that actively craves conflict and drama. This force remains dormant until triggered by a perceived challenge to its territory or a minor disagreement. In that instant, a massive surge of defensive energy arises, often masking deep-seated fear with hostility. The voice alters, the mind races to justify its position, and the ego enters a desperate struggle for survival. It demands victory within the theatrical production it has cast itself in. At that moment of heightened reactivity, we must ask ourselves if we can feel the internal entity that prefers the intoxicating rush of being right over the quiet serenity of being at peace. When the ego mobilizes for war, it is crucial to recognize it as a mere phantom fighting for its own illusory existence, a phantom that has convinced you it is your true self. Observing this mechanism while it is actively triggered is challenging, but each successful instance dilutes the ego's power. Freedom from the ego is achieved not by forceful suppression, but by the simple, illuminating power of awareness. Because awareness and ego cannot occupy the same space, the act of observing the ego dissolves it. This power is intrinsically linked to the present moment. It is the essence of presence. We cannot attain this freedom as a future goal. We can only step into it now. True spiritual realization is not the adoption of a new belief system. It is the profound clarity that our perceptions, emotions, and thoughts do not constitute our fundamental identity. The illusion of the self must be negated to reveal the luminous consciousness that remains, the silent background in which all temporal experiences arise and fade. When this eternal I am is sensed, the events of daily life lose their crushing weight. They are honored, but they no longer possess absolute seriousness. Regardless of its specific behavioral manifestation, the ego's hidden agenda is unvarying: to fortify the phantom self, to stand apart, to exert control, and to demand attention. It operates from a baseline of perpetual deficiency, a gnawing sensation of not enough, that it seeks to fill by manipulating people and circumstances. The ego's fundamental emotional undertone is a profound, unacknowledged fear, the dread of non-existence, of being a nobody. Its frantic activities are elaborate defense mechanisms against this existential terror, offering only fleeting moments of relief through new acquisitions or temporary victories. Yet, because the ego identifies exclusively with transient forms, it is inherently insecure. True peace emerges only when we fully internalize the absolute instability of all structures, even the most seemingly solid material ones. Recognizing the impermanence of the physical world forcefully awakens us to the eternal, formless dimension within, the realm that remains untouched by death and decay. The ego operates through incredibly subtle mechanisms that demand sharp vigilance to detect. Consider the momentary thrill of imparting exclusive news, even if the news itself is tragic. In that fleeting second, the ego relishes an informational imbalance, enjoying a temporary sense of superiority over the listener simply because it possesses knowledge the other lacks. This dynamic fuels the pervasive addiction to gossip, which often carries the added egoic bonus of malicious moral judgment. When confronted with someone who possesses more wealth, knowledge, or skill, the ego feels acutely threatened, experiencing this discrepancy as a personal diminishment. To repair this perceived damage, it may resort to petty criticism or belittlement. Alternatively, it might entirely shift tactics, attempting to siphon off a sense of importance by broadcasting its association with the superior individual. The casual dropping of names is a classic strategy employed by the ego to inflate its own conceptual identity through proximity to perceived greatness. The profound tragedy of achieving fame in our society is that the individual's authentic being is completely eclipsed by a massive, collectively generated mental image. Most interactions with a famous person are entirely inauthentic. Individuals approach them not to connect with a human being, but to extract a sense of specialness by associating with the icon. The famous figure is utilized as a mirror to reflect an enhanced version of the fan's own ego. This collective madness sometimes infects the famous themselves, causing them to identify with their own manufactured persona, leading to profound alienation and an agonizing dependency on public adoration. True visionaries, like Albert Einstein, managed to remain entirely detached from the grotesque caricature constructed by the public, retaining their deep humility. Authentic human connection requires a state of presence, an open, non-transactional attention directed toward another without a hidden agenda of extraction. The ego, however, operates exclusively in states of wanting, thwarted wanting resulting in anger or blame, or complete callous indifference when it determines the other person offers no value to its continuous project of self-enhancement. Chapter 4. Chapter 4. Role-playing, the many faces of the ego. An ego constantly desires something from the world, adopting an array of characters and personas to fulfill its relentless cravings for material gain, psychological dominance, or a fleeting sense of specialness. The vast majority of people are completely oblivious to the theatrical roles they inhabit. They merge entirely with these adopted identities. While some of these masquerades are subtle, others are glaringly transparent to everyone except the actor playing the part. The fundamental objective of these roles is to extract attention, a vital currency of psychic energy. Unaware that the infinite wellspring of life resides within, the ego scavenges the external environment for recognition, praise, or simple acknowledgement to validate its existence. Even the timid individual, who actively cowers from the gaze of others, operates from a deeply conflicted ego that simultaneously yearns for and dreads observation. This dread stems from the fear that external scrutiny will bring criticism and diminishment rather than enhancement. Shyness masks a deep-seated, negative conceptualization of the self, a heavy belief in one's own inadequacy. Whether a person harbors an inflated superiority complex or a crippling inferiority complex, both are manifestations of the egoic structure. The arrogant exterior hides a terrified core of insufficiency, just as the self-deprecating facade conceals a secret, burning desire for absolute supremacy. The pendulum swings wildly between these poles depending on the environment and the audience, but the underlying truth remains constant. Whenever you feel elevated above or diminished below another human being, you are experiencing the ego in motion. When the ego is starved of positive admiration, it will readily settle for negative attention, deliberately provoking conflict to assure itself of its own solidity. This behavior is clearly visible in children who act out, and it amplifies significantly when the emotional pain body, a dense reservoir of past suffering seeking revitalization, becomes active. Some individuals even resort to criminality, seeking notoriety and public condemnation as a desperate plea for significance, demanding the world acknowledge their existence. A pervasive character in this psychological theater is the victim, an identity constructed solely to siphon sympathy, pity, or a captive audience for one's personal tragedies. Once the mind solidifies around a narrative of unjust suffering, the ego fiercely resists any resolution to its dilemmas, as healing would mean the death of the identity it has so carefully built. If no external audience is available, the mind loops the tragic tale internally, reinforcing a self-image defined by the unfairness of life, cruel fate, or callous humanity. In the initial phases of romantic entanglements, this role-playing is the standard currency of interaction. Partners unconsciously agree to perform the idealized versions of what the other desires, desperately hoping this transaction will permanently cure their internal emptiness. However, maintaining this theatrical performance requires immense energy and cannot be sustained indefinitely. When the masks inevitably slip within the confines of daily living, what remains is not the radiant essence of the other person, but the raw, unpolished ego, burdened by its pain body and seething with anger at the partner's failure to eradicate its deep-seated fears and inherent sense of lack. What society romanticizes as falling in love is frequently just an intense amplification of egoic craving and dependency, a far cry from genuine love, which exists entirely free of conditions, wanting, and demands. As early tribal societies evolved into complex ancient civilizations, rigid social stratifications emerged. A person's identity was strictly dictated by their designated occupation, whether a ruler, a laborer, a merchant, or a warrior. This assigned societal function became utterly indistinguishable from their sense of self. Only a handful of extraordinary visionaries, like Jesus or the Buddha, recognized the utter insignificance of these caste systems, understanding that identifying with such fleeting, external structures blinded humanity to the eternal, unconditioned light dwelling within every soul. In our modern era, these societal frameworks have loosened, leaving many individuals adrift, unsure of their place, their purpose, or even who they fundamentally are. When someone confesses that they no longer know who they are, this admission should be celebrated rather than feared. The discomfort they feel is not the tragic loss of knowledge, but the fading of the compulsive limiting belief that they must possess a conceptual definition of their existence. When one finally abandons the desperate search for an intellectual identity to cling to, the resulting confusion evaporates, replaced by a profound, clear stillness. To define oneself through thought is to permanently restrict one's infinite potential. Naturally, a society requires diverse functions and specialized skills to operate, and human beings possess a wide spectrum of talents and energetic capacities. The danger arises not from the function itself, but from merging one's entire identity with that function until it solidifies into an unconscious, mechanical role. Stepping back and witnessing oneself acting out a role creates a vital space of awareness, the first necessary breath of true freedom. Total identification with a role breeds a grotesque, heavy seriousness, reducing other human beings to mere components in one's own conceptual drama. The deeply identified doctor sees only a patient or a case history, never a vibrant, living soul. Despite the relative fluidity of the modern world, numerous archetypal roles continue to dictate behavior, stripping human interactions of their authentic depth. The rigid hierarchies of the military, religious institutions, or corporate conglomerates are incredibly fertile grounds for these suffocating role identities. We see this manifested in universal societal archetypes: the stoic patriarch, the seductive siren, the bohemian rebel, or the cultured intellectual who wields aesthetic knowledge as a weapon of superiority. The most pervasive archetype of all is that of the serious adult, a character entirely devoid of spontaneity, lightheartedness, or unconditioned joy. The massive countercultural movements of the mid-20th century represented a collective, visceral rejection of these suffocating social scripts and the destructive, egoic systems that enforced them. While the movement itself eventually fractured, the crack it left in the collective human psyche allowed ancient spiritual wisdom to permeate the modern consciousness, setting the stage for a much wider global awakening. Keen observation reveals that our speech, posture, and attitude constantly shift in subtle but significant ways depending on the specific person we are interacting with. The deference shown to a corporate executive differs remarkably from the dismissive tone used with a janitor or the patronizing cadence adopted for a child. In these moments, we are entirely disconnected from our true selves, slipping effortlessly into pre-packaged societal scripts. Whether interacting as a customer at a bank or a diner at a restaurant, the exchange is governed by conditioned rules of engagement rather than genuine human connection. Two conceptual phantoms interact, each relating not to the living being before them, but to a mentally fabricated image of the other, filtered entirely through their own fabricated self-image. It is no wonder that relationship conflict is ubiquitous when genuine connection is so extraordinarily rare. Consider the profound lesson embedded in the story of the Zen teacher Kasan, who was preparing to conduct a prestigious funeral service for a prominent aristocrat. Awaiting the arrival of provincial governors and high-ranking nobility, he noticed his palms sweating with anxiety. The following morning, he gathered his devoted students and humbly admitted he was unfit to be their guide. He realized he still lacked the profound, unshakable equanimity required to stand before all people, whether vagabond or emperor, and see only the universal sameness of their underlying being. He abandoned his esteemed position, studied under another master for years, and only returned when he could look straight through the transparent illusion of social rank and conceptual identity. When casually asked about our well-being, the reflexive response is almost invariably a cheerful affirmation, regardless of the internal reality. For a vast segment of humanity, happiness is merely another costume, a smiling mask tightly strapped over a deep reservoir of unspoken anguish. This profound denial of internal suffering inevitably leads to emotional fractures, nervous breakdowns, and depressive collapses. The cultural imperative to present a continuously positive facade prevents authentic healing. If misery exists within, it must first be brought into the light of conscious acknowledgement without merging one's identity with it. One must observe the unhappiness, meticulously separating the factual circumstances of the moment from the tragic stories the mind spins about them. A depleted bank account is a neutral fact. The melodramatic narrative that one is ruined is a self-imposed psychological prison. Seeking happiness as an external goal is a futile pursuit, as the very act of seeking reinforces the illusion that joy is missing and must be acquired. True freedom from misery is attained by unflinchingly accepting the present reality, stripping away the mind's interpretations, and uncovering the deep, unshakable peace that naturally resides beneath the turbulent surface. Interactions with children frequently expose the ego's deep-seated tendency to patronize and adopt highly artificial personas. Fulfilling the necessary functions of guardianship, providing safety, sustenance, and wise guidance, is undeniably essential. However, when the concept of parent calcifies into a core identity, these necessary functions bloat into toxic overprotection, suffocating control, and indulgence. More tragically, this role identity refuses to dissolve even as the child matures into adulthood. The parent remains unconsciously terrified of losing their defining purpose, continuing to manipulate, criticize, or induce guilt in a desperate bid to maintain control and relevance. Behind the socially acceptable facade of caring lies the ego's raw, unvarnished instinct for self-preservation. Parents trapped in this role often unconsciously view their offspring as vessels to fulfill their own dashed ambitions, or to elevate their own status in the eyes of society. When these hidden, coercive motivations are dragged into the light of awareness, their sheer absurdity breaks the spell. Recognizing the egoic pattern without internal resistance allows the dysfunction to wither naturally. Adult children navigating this dynamic must learn to observe the unconsciousness of their parents with compassion, recognizing it as an impersonal force, and free themselves from the deeply ingrained, painful expectation that parental approval is a prerequisite for their own peace. Providing children with guidance and protection must be carefully balanced with the profound necessity of giving them the vast space to experience their own existence. The egoic belief that a parent knows exactly what is best for a child becomes increasingly false as the child grows. The desire to shield a child from all adversity is a fundamental misunderstanding of the human journey. Suffering, while born of the ego's identification with form, is also the very crucible that ultimately destroys that identification. The pain of life drives consciousness deeper. Denying or resisting this suffering only thickens the ego's defensive armor. Accepting it, however, accelerates the alchemy of awakening. The ego protests that suffering is inherently wrong and unjust, but this resistance is the root of true agony. Only by yielding to the reality of the pain can it be transcended, transforming the intense heat of suffering into the brilliant, clarifying light of awareness. The unfulfilled longing of a child is rarely for more material provisions or better parental performance. It is a desperate craving for the parent's authentic, unconditioned presence. The modern family is often entirely consumed by the frantic energy of doing, managing schedules, correcting behaviors, and fulfilling endless obligations. This form-based attention is necessary, but if it is the only currency of connection, the vital, nourishing dimension of being is entirely starved. True connection requires formless attention. It is the ability to look at, listen to, and touch a child with a quiet, spacious alertness, entirely free from the desire to evaluate, correct, or control. In that pristine moment, the heavy mantle of parent falls away, leaving only the radiant stillness of pure consciousness encountering itself in another. To navigate existence masterfully requires harmonizing the functional human aspect with the infinite dimension of being. The roles we play, our physical attributes, and our societal functions belong exclusively to the human realm. This realm is characterized by inherent inequality. Adults are stronger, more knowledgeable, and more capable than children. If a parent operates solely within this dimension, they will unconsciously project superiority, breeding a deep sense of inferiority within the child. Love in this form-bound realm is strictly conditional, possessive, and fleeting. True equality and authentic love exist only in the formless dimension of being. When a parent rests in this eternal, spacious awareness, they recognize their own essence within the child. The illusion of separateness dissolves completely. Love is the profound recognition of this underlying oneness bridging the gap of physical duality. When this recognition is absent, the child experiences a painful void, an agonizing sense of being fundamentally unseen, which eventually hardens into deep-seated, unconscious resentment. The ultimate mastery of life is to execute whatever the present moment demands without allowing that action to calcify into an identity. Actions performed purely for their own sake, entirely free from the ego's desperate need to protect or enhance its image, are infused with unparalleled power. The grand stages of the world, politics, business, entertainment, are heavily populated by individuals completely lost in their theatrical personas, oblivious to the tragic comedy they are acting out, signifying nothing. Yet those rare individuals who operate from the deep well of their true being, completely devoid of pretense, exude a transformative energy that alters the very fabric of reality around them. When the ego is absent from action, there is no hidden agenda, no desperate grasping for validation or superiority. You become entirely absorbed in the task, an open instrument of the universe itself. The common advice to just be yourself is a paradox, as the mind immediately attempts to construct a strategy for this naturalness, thereby creating yet another artificial role. True authenticity is not something you do. It is the radiant potentiality that remains when you drop the baggage and become completely comfortable with not knowing who you conceptually are. The ego adopts these masks because it operates from the foundational, terrifying delusion that it is incomplete and insufficient. It mistakenly believes that playing a part will secure the resources necessary to fill its existential void. In truth, genuine humility and unshakable self-esteem are identical. Both arise from the profound realization that beneath the shifting forms of the world, you are already one with life itself. The very architecture of the ego is fundamentally pathological. It is synonymous with suffering and dysfunction. Yet the ego is entirely blind to the agony it generates, constantly convincing the individual that their misery, anger, and resentment are entirely justified responses to a hostile world. It projects the blame for its internal pollution outward, creating a global epidemic of emotional toxicity that mirrors the physical pollution of the planet. The ego cannot distinguish between a neutral event, such as a cold, rainy day, and its own turbulent, resistant reaction to it. It frequently mistakes the intense, adrenaline-fueled surge of righteousness or anger for genuine pleasure, utterly oblivious to the physiological devastation these toxic emotional states wreak upon the physical body, disrupting the heart, digestion, and immune system. Whenever negative emotions arise, it signifies that a fragment of the psyche is actively enjoying the drama or falsely believing it serves a protective purpose. To catch sight of this perverse attachment to misery in the exact moment it occurs is to witness the ego directly. In that brilliant flash of recognition, identity shifts from the suffering entity to the silent, observing awareness. Recognizing the sheer lack of intelligence inherent in negativity shatters its grip. True intelligence is the holistic comprehension of interconnectedness, whereas the ego's cleverness is a fragmented, myopic pursuit of self-interest that ultimately ensures its own destruction. Beyond explosive anger or profound despair lies a pervasive, low-grade negativity that forms the standard operating frequency for much of humanity. This continuous static of impatience, irritation, and generalized discontent is so ubiquitous, it is deemed perfectly normal. It is sustained by deep, unexamined cognitive loops, whispering incessantly just below the threshold of awareness, much like a dream occurs during sleep. These unconscious scripts invariably insist that peace is impossible now because of a past transgression, a current imperfection, or a future requirement. The mind insists that external circumstances or the behaviors of other people must alter before inner fulfillment can be achieved. This constant rejection of the present reality, this refusal of the suchness of life, is the very engine of the ego's survival. These unexamined narratives are elaborate fictions designed to obscure the truth that peace can only ever be accessed in the present moment. The ego fiercely resists the reality of what is, creating the constant friction necessary to sustain its illusion of separateness. To inflict suffering upon oneself and the world while remaining entirely oblivious to the process is the definition of spiritual sleep. To break this ancient curse, one must assume absolute responsibility for their internal state in the immediate present. By bringing intense, non-judgmental awareness to the subtle currents of discontent and the thought patterns that justify them, the identification with these states collapses. This is not denial or suppression, it is the alchemical fire of observation. You realize that you are not the heavy conditioned emotions or the repetitive thoughts, but the vast luminous space of presence in which they momentarily appear. While the normal ego is characterized by subtle dysfunction, certain extremes manifest as recognized mental illnesses. Compulsive liars construct elaborate, fictitious realities to soothe the ego's desperate feelings of insufficiency, building grandiose self-images that fool others only briefly. In paranoid schizophrenia, the ego's inherent fear of the other is magnified into terrifying delusions of persecution. The individual constructs a reality where they are the focal point of malicious conspiracies, paradoxically fulfilling the ego's deep-seated need to feel intensely special and central to the universe. This same paranoid architecture operates on a collective scale, driving the horrific atrocities committed by tribes, nations, and religious sects throughout history. When dialogue fails, the ego, terrified of annihilation, violently defends its mental positions as if they were its physical life, mistaking opinions for ultimate truth. Releasing one's desperate grip on opinions is the gateway to discovering the truth that exists far beyond the limitations of the mind. There are moments when individuals become so entirely absorbed in their craft or service that the ego vanishes entirely. They merge seamlessly with the present moment, their work becoming a flawless expression of spiritual practice, even if they remain unconscious of it in their private lives. These individuals do not seek personal aggrandizement. They are conduits for a higher intelligence, and their mere presence elevates the consciousness of those around them, causing others to drop their own defensive roles. Conversely, those dominated by the ego pollute their work with constant demands for recognition, power, and profit. When confronted with inevitable obstacles, instead of flowing with the situation, they generate massive resistance, wasting precious energy on resentment and conflict. Their inability to cooperate and their secret joy in the failures of others ensure that the universe responds with equal friction, sabotaging their own potential for true success. Physical ailment presents a profound crossroads for the ego. It can utilize the illness to construct a massive, fortified identity around being a sufferer, drawing energy from complaints and demanding endless attention, thereby strengthening its false sense of self. Alternatively, the severe depletion of physical energy can starve the egoic mind, allowing a profound gentleness, inner peace, and luminous wisdom to emerge through the weakening form. Those who unconsciously use illness to bolster the ego invariably prolong their suffering and hinder the body's natural healing intelligence, trapping themselves in a chronic state of conceptual disease long after the physical symptoms might have abated. Finding the solitary personal ego unbearable and insufficient, many attempt to expand their identity by merging with a collective entity, a nation, a political ideology, a corporation, a religion, or a sect. While this may provide temporary relief from the burden of personal inadequacy, creating a powerful illusion of selfless dedication, the collective ego exhibits the exact same pathological traits on a massively magnified scale. It requires external enemies to define its borders, thrives on opposition, and ultimately guarantees immense suffering for its members. The insanity of the crowd far exceeds the insanity of the individual. As humanity slowly awakens, new, enlightened groups will form, not as fortified egoic structures demanding identity and allegiance, but as dynamic vortices of conscious presence. These collectives will serve to rapidly accelerate the planetary shift, recognizing and dissolving egoic patterns as they arise rather than defending them. The very genesis of the ego involves a psychic fracture, splitting the self into an observer and an observed concept, an I and a myself. This creates the bizarre, schizophrenic illusion that you have a relationship with your own life, rather than understanding that you are life itself. The phrase "my life" encapsulates the ultimate delusion of separateness. If life is a possession that can be lost, then death becomes a terrifying, looming reality. But if you are the indivisible, eternal expression of being, the concept of losing your life becomes a logical impossibility. You cannot lose the absolute reality of what you fundamentally are. Chapter 5. Chapter 5. The Pain Body. The vast majority of human thought is entirely involuntary, functioning as a repetitive, automatic mechanism that chatters endlessly without serving any genuine, constructive purpose. It is a form of persistent mental static. To claim "I think" implies a degree of conscious volition, a deliberate choice in the matter, but for most individuals, this is a profound illusion. Thinking simply happens to them, much like digestion or the circulation of blood. The voice within the head possesses a sovereign life of its own, and humanity has spent millennia increasingly possessed by this entity, mistakenly believing that this relentless narrator is their true identity. When you are completely identified with the mind, you are forced to endlessly reenact the conditioning of the past, a karmic loop that dictates your reality. The density of your ego is directly proportional to the degree to which your consciousness is entangled with this cognitive stream. Those trapped within this egoic state experience a profound alienation, not only from their own deepest essence, but from the world and the people around them. This pervasive sense of existential unease, brilliantly articulated by literary figures like Kafka and Camus, leaves one constantly seeking a sense of home, while forever feeling like a stranger. Operating in tandem with this movement of thought is another dimension of the ego, emotion. The physical body is governed by an exquisite, organizing intelligence that orchestrates the incredibly complex functions necessary for survival. This bodily intelligence constantly monitors and reacts to the directives of the mind. Emotion, fundamentally, is the body's physiological reaction to your thoughts. In the natural world, an animal experiences an instinctive response to an immediate, external threat. The heart races and muscles tense in preparation for fight or flight. These are primordial survival mechanisms. A human emotion, however, is a response to a mental interpretation, a reaction to a thought filtered through the ego's categories of good, bad, mine, or theirs. The body's intelligence is profound, yet it cannot distinguish between a tangible physical threat in the present environment and an anxious thought projected into an imaginary future. When the mind spins a fearful narrative, the body prepares for an attack that never materializes. The resulting surge of survival energy finds no physical outlet, turning toxic and disrupting the harmonious functioning of the organism. The ego, therefore, is not merely the unobserved voice in the head. It is also the unobserved emotion echoing in the body. The mind spins a fabricated story. The body believes it implicitly and reacts with emotion. And that emotion, in turn, feeds its energy directly back into the mind, generating a vicious, self-sustaining loop of emotional thinking. Often, these emotional triggers are rooted in unspoken, pre-verbal assumptions forged in the fires of childhood conditioning, deeply held beliefs that the world is hostile, that one is unworthy of love, or that survival requires constant struggle. These negative emotional states, which encompass fear, anxiety, anger, jealousy, and resentment, are fundamentally toxic, acting as a disruptive force upon the body's immune and cardiovascular systems. Even the positive emotions generated by the ego are precarious, containing the seeds of their own inevitable opposites. Egoic love quickly curdles into possessive hatred. Joyous anticipation plunges into bitter disappointment. True, unshakable emotions, such as profound joy and deep peace, are not generated by external circumstances. They are inherent states of being that radiate from within and possess no opposite. To understand the unnatural burden of human emotional memory, consider the behavior of waterfowl. When two birds engage in a sudden, violent territorial skirmish, the conflict is remarkably brief. Upon separating, they vigorously flap their wings to discharge the massive buildup of adrenaline and survival energy. Then they glide across the water in absolute serenity, entirely unaffected by the encounter. If these creatures possessed a human mind, they would be incapable of such effortless release. The mind would relentlessly replay the event, constructing a narrative of grievance, plotting revenge, and maintaining the body in a continuous state of toxic biochemical stress long after the physical event had ended. The birds teach us a profound spiritual lesson. We must learn to metaphorically flap our wings, releasing the narratives of the mind and returning our attention completely to the pristine power of the present moment. The human refusal to relinquish the past is perfectly encapsulated in the ancient tale of two monks navigating a muddy road. Encountering a young woman unable to cross without ruining her silken garments, the older monk simply picks her up, carries her across the mire, and sets her down. Hours later, the younger monk, seething with internal conflict over the violation of their monastic vows, finally bursts out in accusation. The older monk replies with profound simplicity, noting that he had set the woman down hours ago, asking why his companion was still carrying her. The vast majority of humanity lives precisely in this manner, heavily burdened by an invisible, suffocating weight of mental and emotional baggage. While factual memories are necessary for practical learning, the psychological retention of past hurts, invested with a false sense of identity, transforms personal history into a prison. We accumulate old, unprocessed emotion, carrying it within our energetic field. This accumulation of unresolved pain forms a distinct entity, the pain body. When children encounter negative emotions too overwhelming to process, their only psychological defense is to subconsciously shut down and refuse to feel them. Without a conscious adult to guide them through the experience, these suppressed emotions do not simply vanish. They leave behind a dense, energetic residue. As we progress through adolescence and adulthood, the continuous stream of egoic thinking adds layer upon layer of fresh misery to this underlying reservoir. The pain body is forged from this lifelong accumulation of emotional agony. Yet its roots plunge even deeper. The individual pain body is inextricably woven into the collective pain body of humanity, a staggering repository of suffering accumulated through millennia of warfare, genocide, slavery, and systemic cruelty. Every infant arrives in this world already bearing a localized expression of this collective trauma, some carrying a much denser, heavier burden than others. This is why some newborns appear to carry an inexplicable, inconsolable sorrow, absorbing the toxic emotional emanations of their environment. However, possessing a heavy pain body does not permanently doom an individual to unconsciousness. In fact, the sheer intolerability of the suffering often acts as a powerful catalyst, driving them relentlessly towards spiritual awakening. The agonizing image of a suffering savior, prominent in many religious traditions, resonates so deeply precisely because it serves as an archetypal mirror for the collective human pain body. This pain body operates as a semi-autonomous energetic entity, possessing a primitive, cunning intelligence entirely focused on its own survival. Like any living organism, it requires periodic nourishment to replenish itself. It cannot consume just any energy. It demands sustenance that perfectly matches its own dense, low-frequency vibration. It hungers for negativity, drama, and emotional pain. For most individuals, this parasitic entity oscillates between periods of dormancy and highly active phases. When it slumbers, one might easily forget that a volatile volcano resides within their psyche. But when the pain body awakens, triggered by an external event or simply by its own cyclical hunger, it aggressively seeks out the emotional toxicity it needs to thrive. If no external source of drama is immediately available, the awakened pain body will turn inward, feeding ravenously upon your own thoughts. It hijacks the internal dialogue, seizing control of the mind. Suddenly, your thought processes become overwhelmingly dark, pessimistic, and accusatory. The pain body cannot digest joyful or peaceful thoughts. Their high vibrational frequency is incompatible with its nature. Instead, the entity feeds on the energy of your anxieties, resentments, and self-pity. In this state, the normal dynamic of the mind-generating emotion is inverted. The raw, negative emotion of the pain body dictates the thoughts, turning the voice in your head into the voice of the pain body itself. You become utterly identified with these distorted narratives, believing them to be absolute truth, willingly supplying the entity with the energetic sustenance it requires until it is satiated and returns to dormancy, leaving you physically drained and emotionally hollow. When other people are present, the pain body actively seeks to provoke them, desperately trying to push their emotional buttons to extract a reaction. It is incredibly adept at locating the deepest vulnerabilities of a romantic partner or family member. The objective is to awaken the other person's dormant pain body so that the two entities can engage in a mutually sustaining feeding frenzy of conflict and drama. Many intimate relationships are locked into this exact cycle, enduring violent, destructive episodes that inflict immense psychological damage, particularly upon children forced to witness the psychic warfare. Alcohol frequently serves as a potent trigger, disabling the mind's normal restraints and allowing the pain body to assume absolute control, often resulting in devastating physical or emotional violence. The deeply unconscious individual, upon sobering up, may express genuine remorse, entirely unaware that the entity promising never to offend again is not the same entity that committed the violence. Without the light of conscious presence to observe and disidentify from this pattern, the cycle is guaranteed to repeat. Pain bodies are magnetically drawn to one another. An individual with a complementary energetic dysfunction will often be mistaken for a soulmate. It is a chilling realization to look into the eyes of a loved one and see the radiant essence entirely eclipsed by a heavy, hostile veil, the chilling gaze of an alien entity that has temporarily taken possession of the human host, twisting reality to suit its need for suffering. Some individuals harbor pain bodies so incredibly dense that they rarely enter a state of true dormancy. They exude a continuous simmering tension, their energy field a seething cauldron of unexpressed hostility waiting for the slightest provocation. They magnify the ego's inherent need for opposition, blowing trivial inconveniences completely out of proportion to generate conflict. They become embroiled in endless, protracted legal battles, consume themselves with obsessive hatred toward former partners, or dedicate their lives to fighting against perceived injustices. While their causes may sometimes appear noble on the surface, the toxic, combative energy they inject into their activism inevitably breeds corresponding resistance, frequently creating enemies even within their own ranks. Because they lack basic self-awareness, they project their internal agony onto the external world, entirely blind to the fact that they are the primary architects of their own misery. The collective appetite for this low-frequency energy is massive, sustaining entire sectors of the media and entertainment industries. We must question what aspect of the human psyche willingly pays money to witness simulated murder, torture, and suffering on a cinematic screen. It is, undeniably, the pain body seeking a vicarious feeding. While art that honestly portrays the horrific realities and consequences of violence can serve as a vital mirror for humanity's collective insanity, entertainment that normalizes or glamorizes brutality serves solely to administer a narcotic fix to the addicted pain body. Similarly, the tabloid press and large segments of the news media capitalize on this addiction, recognizing that screaming headlines of outrage, disaster, and scandal are highly effective mechanisms for capturing attention and selling negative emotion to a ravenous public. Beyond the individual, the pain body possesses vast collective dimensions segmented by tribe, nation, and race. There is a deeply entrenched collective female pain body, a heavy energetic burden shared by almost all women, which frequently activates in alignment with the physical cycles of the body. For millennia, the violent suppression of the sacred feminine principle allowed the unbalanced, male-dominated ego to achieve absolute supremacy on this planet, leading to our current state of environmental and social crisis. The horrific torture and execution of millions of women during the Inquisition stands as a stark testament to the ego's terrified paranoia of the feminine. This historical trauma has been internalized, manifesting as acute emotional pain. Yet, because the ego could never root itself as deeply within the female form, women are currently experiencing a more rapid dissolution of this egoic grip, playing a pivotal leading role in the awakening of global consciousness. Similarly, older nations and populations subjected to centuries of systemic violence, warfare, or oppression bear incredibly heavy racial and national pain bodies. The legacy of slavery and the brutal displacement of indigenous populations remain violently alive within the energetic fields of these communities. These collective traumas frequently trap populations in seemingly endless, insane cycles of retaliation and bloodshed, where the pain body perpetually renews itself through the infliction of fresh agony. However, the path to liberation remains identical, regardless of whether the pain body's origin is deeply personal or historically collective. One must assume absolute responsibility for their internal state in the present moment. Clinging to blame, even when historically justified, merely feeds the entity and ensures the continuation of the egoic prison. True forgiveness is the profound realization that human unconsciousness is the sole perpetrator of all evil. By bringing the illuminating light of presence to the pain body exactly as it arises, the victim identity shatters, the cycle of suffering is broken, and the dark, heavy energy is alchemically transmuted into the radiant power of pure consciousness. Chapter 6. Breaking Free. The initial step toward liberating oneself from the heavy burden of the pain body is the simple yet profound realization that such an entity resides within you. This requires cultivating a state of presence vigilant enough to detect this accumulation of past suffering the very moment it surges forth as a dark wave of negative emotion. The instant you recognize it, the entity's primary defense mechanism is shattered. It can no longer masquerade as your true identity. By bringing the light of conscious awareness to this shadow, you sever its parasitic connection to your cognitive processes. Denied access to your mind, it can no longer sustain itself by gorging on your fearful or angry thoughts. Although this energetic mass does not evaporate instantly, this vital disconnection starves it of fuel. The dense, trapped energy gradually begins to vibrate at a higher frequency, alchemically transmuting into the very light of conscious presence. This profound metamorphosis is the reason why some of the most luminous and awakened individuals in human history were once burdened by exceptionally heavy pain bodies. The internal state of any human being cannot be completely masked. It continuously radiates outward as an energetic field. We absorb these emanations from others, often subliminally, and they deeply influence our initial reactions and feelings toward them. When people carrying active, volatile pain bodies intersect, the results are frequently explosive. Consider the sudden, terrifying eruptions of violence on our roadways, where seemingly ordinary individuals transform into enraged maniacs over minor slights. In those moments of blind rage, two active pain bodies have collided, each unconsciously desiring the violent confrontation. In courtrooms across the globe, perpetrators of violence often express genuine bewilderment at their own actions, claiming a temporary loss of character. In a profound spiritual sense, they are entirely accurate. They were operating under a state of diminished responsibility, wholly possessed by an autonomous entity of pain that commandeered their physical form. To be completely unconscious is to be devoid of true responsibility, yet the evolutionary imperative of the universe demands that humanity awaken, and the suffering generated by this unconsciousness is the very mechanism driving that evolution. This transformative power of presence is frequently demonstrated in the crucible of therapeutic encounters. Consider the case of a woman who sought guidance, her polite exterior barely concealing a vast reservoir of anguish. Her childhood had been marred by severe abuse, leaving her with an extraordinarily dense pain body that acted as a dark, distorting lens over her entire life. She was entirely fused with her suffering, unable to differentiate the raw emotional pain from the tragic narrative she endlessly replayed in her mind. When instructed to shift her attention away from her stories and directly into the raw, physical sensation of the emotion itself, she initially resisted, expecting a method to escape her unhappiness rather than dive into it. Yet, as she reluctantly allowed the pure feeling to exist without the mental commentary, the resistance dissolved. By simply abandoning the desire for the present moment to be different, by accepting the unhappiness without minding it, a profound shift occurred. She discovered a vast, peaceful spaciousness surrounding her pain. The emotion remained, but it had lost its absolute power. It was no longer her identity. In that session, the dimension of pure presence emerged, initiating the gradual dissolution of her pain body through the simple, non-resistant light of awareness. Curiously, the energy released during such profound internal shifts does not simply vanish, it occasionally seeks resonance elsewhere. Shortly after the woman's departure, the heavy residual energy of that release was palpably felt in the room. Later that evening, in a nearby restaurant, this phenomenon seemed to manifest externally. A diner in a wheelchair, previously calm, suddenly erupted into a torrent of vile, abusive rage directed at the staff over a trivial matter. The hostility he radiated was almost tangible, a raw, screaming hunger for conflict. While one cannot definitively prove a causal link, it perfectly illustrated the nature of the universal human pain body, constantly seeking a compatible frequency, a host willing to act out its insatiable desire to inflict and experience suffering. The manifestation of this entity is equally prevalent, though often less understood, in the lives of children. Parents frequently watch in bewildered helplessness as their seemingly peaceful child is suddenly consumed by a violent temper tantrum or a bout of sullen, impenetrable withdrawal. This emotional storm is often triggered by a frustrated desire, a thwarted wanting that instantly awakens the child's share of the collective human pain body. Furthermore, highly sensitive children frequently absorb the toxic, unspoken negativity radiating from their parents' suppressed pain bodies. The most destructive environments for a developing psyche are not necessarily those with open conflict, but those where a veneer of polite conversation masks a thick, unacknowledged atmosphere of hostility. When a child is engulfed by a pain body attack, a parent's most vital response is to remain entirely present, refusing to be drawn into the theatrical drama or to reward the entity by yielding to its demands. Once the storm has passed, the parent can gently cultivate the child's own observing awareness by asking curious, non-judgmental questions about the creature that took over, helping the child naturally disidentify from the overwhelming emotion. It is crucial to differentiate between the ancient, accumulated weight of the pain body and the fresh unhappiness we generate daily. New suffering is manufactured whenever we internally resist the inevitable reality of the present moment. However, when the pain body activates, The resulting unhappiness is glaringly disproportionate to the event that triggered it. A trivial inconvenience that a conscious individual might dismiss with a smile becomes the catalyst for profound despair or explosive rage. This occurs because the triggering event is not the true cause. It is merely the spark that ignites a vast reserve of dormant, historical pain. The ego and the pain body operate in a symbiotic alliance. The ego provides the distorted negative narrative, and the pain body supplies the volatile emotional fuel. When trapped in this cycle, the individual is utterly convinced of the objective reality of their suffering, entirely incapable of recognizing that they are interpreting the present through the deeply traumatized lens of the past. The energy emitted by a heavily active pain body is often perceived by others as intensely repulsive, prompting them to instinctively withdraw. Conversely, it can trigger a reciprocal wave of aggression in those who harbor a similar resonant frequency within themselves. Thus, individuals burdened by dense pain bodies are frequently magnets for hostility and conflict. Navigating an interaction with such an individual requires an extraordinary degree of alert presence. By refusing to react, to judge, or to validate their distorted narrative, your stillness can occasionally act as a mirror, shocking the other person into a sudden, albeit brief, disidentification from their own pain body. This phenomenon, known in Zen as satori, is a fleeting glimpse of pure awareness, a momentary stepping outside the suffocating stream of mental noise. When a distressed neighbor, convinced she is the victim of a malicious conspiracy, arrives in a state of frantic agitation, the most profound intervention is not to offer solutions or argue with her delusions. The ultimate healing lies in holding a space of absolute, non-judgmental silence. In the face of pure presence, the mind's frantic storytelling loses its momentum. The pain body is starved of the reactive friction it craves, and a profound, restful peace can suddenly emerge from the chaos. As one cultivates this internal vigilance, the specific triggers that awaken the pain body become increasingly clear. These triggers are highly individualized, often echoing the specific traumas of one's early development. For an individual raised in an environment where financial scarcity generated constant anxiety and conflict, the slightest monetary concern might provoke an overwhelming, irrational terror, causing them to project issues of existential survival onto a simple banking error. Someone deeply scarred by early abandonment might experience a catastrophic emotional collapse if a partner is merely a few minutes late. In the realm of intimate relationships, these unresolved historical patterns often create a magnetic, unconscious attraction to partners who embody the very characteristics of the original trauma, leading to a tragic, compulsive repetition of the painful dynamic. The remedy lies in acute awareness. By recognizing these triggers as they occur, and by establishing a mutual agreement with a partner to gently call out these pain body activations without judgment, the entity is dragged into the illuminating light of consciousness, where its negative energy is gradually burned away. Paradoxically, this internal entity, which appears to be the ultimate adversary to spiritual liberation, often serves as the most potent catalyst for awakening. The ego enthusiastically merges with the pain body, utilizing the intense emotional charge to solidify its own identity as a tragic victim or a righteous combatant. Yet, this unholy alliance carries the seeds of its own destruction. When the suffering generated by this fusion reaches an unbearable critical mass, the sheer voltage of the pain shatters the egoic structures. The individual is driven to their absolute limit, arriving at a breaking point where the continuation of the unhappy me is no longer tolerable. In this agonizing crucible, they are forced to completely disidentify from their mental narratives and emotional turmoil. The pain body, in its relentless pursuit of suffering, unwittingly forces the individual into a state of absolute presence. While this agonizing path was once the primary route to enlightenment, the current evolutionary acceleration on our planet allows many to voluntarily step out of their conditioning, recognizing the dysfunction and choosing presence without requiring the catalyst of absolute devastation. The question of how much time is required to achieve freedom from this inherited burden is fundamentally flawed, as it misunderstands the nature of the liberation. The suffering is not caused by the mere existence of the pain body, but by the ego's absolute identification with it. Therefore, freedom from identification requires no time whatsoever.
The very instant you recognize the heavy, negative emotion as the pain body, the identification is broken. You become the silent watcher. The historical emotion may continue to ripple through your physical form for a duration, but it is no longer permitted to hijack your mind or dictate your actions. It is crucial in this moment of observation to avoid the egoic trap of pathologizing yourself. Judging the pain body as a personal flaw or a problem to be eradicated merely creates a new, subtler layer of resistance. True transmutation requires absolute acceptance, allowing the uncomfortable sensations to exist within the vast, spacious container of your conscious awareness. Through this radical allowing, the illusion of fragmentation dissolves and you align with the fundamental wholeness of your true, eternal nature. Chapter 7. Finding out who you really are. Carved in stone above the threshold of the ancient oracle at Delphi were the profound words, "Know thyself." Pilgrims journeyed to this sacred site seeking prophecies, desperate to uncover what the future held or what choices to make in the face of adversity. Yet, the vast majority likely crossed that threshold completely blind to the reality that the inscription held a truth infinitely more vital than any prediction the oracle could offer. They failed to grasp that receiving the most accurate vision of tomorrow would not spare them from the relentless cycle of self-inflicted misery unless they first deciphered the imperative etched above the door. The ancient carving presents the ultimate prerequisite for a meaningful existence. Before you interrogate the universe about your destiny, you must answer the most foundational question of all: who am I? When posed with this question, those who navigate life in a state of spiritual slumber will reflexively rattle off a catalogue of labels. They will offer their given name, their profession, the intricate narrative of their past, or the physical condition of their bodies. Even those who have grazed the periphery of spiritual philosophy might confidently declare themselves to be an immortal soul or a living spirit. However, if these lofty terms are merely adopted concepts floating in the intellect, they remain powerless to dismantle the heavily fortified, deeply conditioned core of the false identity. Genuine self-knowledge is not the accumulation of novel ideas or the embrace of a comforting belief system. To truly know yourself is to drop the anchor of your awareness deep into the bedrock of being, descending far below the turbulent, conceptual surface of the mind. The precise definition you hold of yourself dictates the parameters of your reality, determining what you perceive as essential and what possesses the power to agitate your spirit. To measure the depth of your own self-knowledge, you need only observe what disrupts your peace. It is not your proclaimed philosophies that reveal your true identity, but the visceral reactions that escape you when challenged. If minor, fleeting inconveniences can trigger a storm of anxiety or rage, it is a glaring revelation that your internal sense of self is equally small and fragile. You may earnestly believe you are a transcendent spirit seeking only serenity, but the sudden collapse of a financial deal, the theft of a vehicle, or the unexpected arrival of an abrasive relative will instantly expose the truth. When the pulse quickens, the voice sharpens, and the mind launches into a frantic defense or bitter accusation, the immortal spirit vanishes. In its place stands the panicked, diminished me, terrified of loss and desperate for security in a world composed entirely of transient forms. If peace were truly your paramount desire, and if you genuinely identified as formless awareness, you would meet these disruptions with an unshakable, alert stillness. You would instantly harmonize with the unfolding situation rather than severing yourself from it through resistance. Your response would emerge from a place of immense power and clarity, fundamentally incapable of reducing any circumstance or individual to the status of an enemy. The physical world is an unyielding mirror, constantly reflecting back the true nature of your self-identification. The narrower and more ego-driven your self-concept, the more hypersensitive you become to the unconscious limitations of others. You fixate on their perceived flaws, magnifying them until those flaws constitute their entire identity in your eyes. This mechanism merely feeds your own ego. However, when you realize that the traits you vehemently condemn in another are deeply rooted within yourself, you stop playing the victim and take the first critical step toward awareness. Recognizing the ego within is not the discovery of your true self, but rather the essential recognition of who you are not. You cannot be told who you are.
Any definition would simply be another conceptual trap. You already are your true essence. The journey is not one of acquisition, but of realization, allowing the hidden treasure of your unmanifested potential to finally radiate into the world. This conceptual identity is intimately bound to how you perceive your treatment by the universe and the people within it. A pervasive chorus of complaint echoes through humanity, the lament of being disrespected, ignored, unloved, or utilized. At the core of these grievances lies a deeply entrenched self-image of an impoverished, needy entity perpetually denied its rightful due. This fundamental distortion sabotages relationships and guarantees a reality defined by scarcity. When the concept of lack becomes the foundation of your identity, you become entirely blind to the abundance that surrounds you. The universe mirrors your internal state. Whatever you believe the world is withholding from you, you are, in fact, withholding from the world because you erroneously believe you have nothing of value to offer. To break this cycle of deprivation, one must initiate the outward flow. If you feel starved for appreciation, praise, or affection, begin by offering those exact qualities to others. Even if it feels artificial at first, act as if you possess an infinite reservoir of these gifts. The immutable law of the universe dictates that outflow governs inflow. You cannot receive what you refuse to give. Abundance is not a material acquisition. It is an internal realization. Acknowledge the profound fullness of life in the simplest of things: the warmth of sunlight, the vibrant colors of a storefront, the sheer volume of water cascading from the sky. This conscious recognition of external fullness awakens the dormant abundance within your own being. The ancient teaching that to the one who has, more will be given perfectly articulates this law. Both scarcity and abundance are internal frequencies that inevitably manifest as your external reality. The resistance to true self-knowledge often stems from a hidden, terrifying suspicion that we are fundamentally flawed or bad. Yet, nothing you can discover about yourself is the essence of who you actually are. Conversely, some individuals are consumed by a voracious, intellectual curiosity about their own psychological makeup, spending decades in psychoanalytic excavation, unearthing the complex strata of their childhood conditioning. At the conclusion of this exhaustive pursuit, they may possess a massive dossier detailing every neurosis and historical trauma. While they finally know everything about themselves, a hollow ache of incompleteness remains. They have merely charted the topography of their mental content. Whether it is your financial status, your relationship history, or your psychological profile, it is all content. To say "my life" implies a separation, a reduction of the majestic life force into a conceptual possession. True self-knowledge requires stepping entirely out of this content and recognizing yourself as the vast, luminous space of consciousness that allows the content to exist in the first place. When your identity is tethered exclusively to content, your perception of the world becomes violently fragmented into categories of good and bad. You judge events based solely on how they affect the narrative of your small, conceptual self. This myopic vision completely misses the majestic, interconnected wholeness of life, where every occurrence, no matter how tragic or chaotic it appears on the surface, plays an essential role in a higher, unfolding order. To the analytical mind, an untouched, ancient forest appears as a chaotic tangle of life and death, an incomprehensible mess of decaying matter and emergent growth. The mind vastly prefers the rigid, manicured predictability of a landscaped park. Yet, if you silence the mental noise and observe the wild forest with deep stillness, you can sense a profound, sacred harmony. You realize that this incomprehensible order operates far beyond the simplistic human labels of good and bad. When you align with this hidden sacredness, you cease to be a separate observer and become a conscious participant in the miraculous unfolding of the cosmos. The human experience inevitably involves the pendulum swing between creation and destruction, winning and losing, birth and decay. The mind frantically attempts to label these fluctuations, but these labels are ultimately illusory, based on a severely restricted vantage point. Consider the ancient parable of the wise man who wins a luxurious car. When his neighbors celebrate his good fortune, he simply replies, maybe. Weeks later, a horrific accident destroys the car and leaves him hospitalized. When the neighbors offer their condolences for his bad luck, he again replies, maybe. While he is recovering in the hospital, a catastrophic landslide obliterates his home. The neighbors marvel at his good luck for being safely away, to which he offers his eternal refrain, maybe. This response is the ultimate refusal to judge the present moment. By declining to brand the event with a mental label, he remains in perfect conscious alignment with the higher order of the universe, acknowledging that the human mind cannot possibly trace the infinite interconnected causes and ultimate purposes of any given event. The great spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti once stunned an audience that had followed him for decades by revealing the core secret of his enlightened state. I don't mind what happens. This simple phrase carries earth-shattering implications. To not mind what happens is to exist in a state of absolute internal non-resistance to the suchness of the present moment. It is the refusal to wage war against the undeniable reality of what already is. This does not mandate a life of passive inaction. Rather, when your actions are rooted in a deep internal friendship with the present moment, they are supercharged by the infinite intelligence of life itself. This transcendent equanimity is perfectly illustrated by the Zen master Hakuin, whose reputation was destroyed when a young woman falsely accused him of fathering her child. Confronted by her enraged parents, he offered no defense, no anger, and no denial, simply stating, "Is that so?" He accepted the societal disgrace and lovingly raised the child. Years later, when the guilt-stricken mother confessed the truth and the parents returned to beg for forgiveness and reclaim the infant, Hakuin surrendered the child with the exact same serene response, "Is that so?" He met triumph and disaster with identical stillness. He allowed the form of the moment to exist exactly as it was, refusing to become a participant in the chaotic drama of the human ego. Because he did not resist reality, reality held absolutely no power over him. The foundational relationship of your entire existence is your relationship with the present moment. The ego can be definitively diagnosed as a chronically dysfunctional relationship with the now. The ego perceives the present moment in one of three toxic ways: as a mere stepping stone to a more desirable future, as a frustrating obstacle preventing fulfillment, or as an outright enemy to be fought and conquered. As long as you treat the present moment as an adversary, the universe will reflect that hostility, and your life will become an endless battlefield. The dissolution of the ego occurs in the exact instant you make the conscious, radical decision to treat the present moment as your most cherished friend, welcoming it regardless of the disguise it wears. This transformation requires untangling the ultimate paradox of time. The ego is a creature of time, entirely dependent on the past for its identity and the future for its salvation. It perceives life as a relentless progression of fleeting moments. Yet, direct experience reveals that there is no past and no future. There is only ever the eternal now. Time is a conceptual illusion created when we confuse the spaciousness of the present moment with the transient content unfolding within it. While practical clock time is necessary to navigate the physical world, psychological time, the mind's obsessive dwelling on what was and what will be, is the greatest impediment to spiritual awakening. Chapter 8. Chapter 8. The Discovery of Inner Space. An ancient Sufi parable tells of a monarch who lived in a state of perpetual emotional whiplash, swinging violently between fleeting euphoria and crushing despair. The smallest triumph would elate him, yet the slightest setback would plunge him into profound misery. Exhausted by this agonizing pendulum, he summoned a revered sage, offering any price for the secret to unshakable serenity and balance. The wise man declined any material reward, presenting the king instead with a simple jade box containing a plain gold ring. Etched into the gold was a brief inscription, "This too will pass." The sage instructed the monarch to touch the ring and silently recite the words before pronouncing any situation as either a blessing or a curse. At a superficial glance, this phrase might seem to offer mere consolation during periods of hardship, while simultaneously threatening to dampen the joy of pleasant experiences by reminding us of their inevitable end. However, its true power is unlocked when viewed alongside the profound principles of non-resistance, non-judgment, and non-attachment. The inscription is not a cynical warning against enjoying life. Rather, it is a masterclass in recognizing the absolute impermanence of all worldly forms. When you deeply internalize the fleeting nature of every situation, your desperate clinging to external circumstances begins to loosen. This detachment does not render you cold or incapable of joy. Paradoxically, it allows you to engage with the world's pleasures more fully because the paralyzing fear of their eventual loss has evaporated. You rise above the suffocating grip of the immediate drama, attaining a vast, elevated vantage point. Much like an astronaut gazing down at the Earth, recognizing its breathtaking beauty alongside its cosmic insignificance, the acknowledgement that this, too, will pass carves out a profound dimension of inner space within your psyche. This detachment breeds a serenity that is not of this world, a peace that emanates from the formless void rather than from any transient object or event. By releasing the impossible demand that the external world provide you with lasting fulfillment and identity, you dismantle the very engine of self-created suffering. The daily reality for the vast majority of humanity is an existence entirely choked with things. We are buried under material accumulations, endless to-do lists, and an unrelenting avalanche of thoughts. This is the domain of object consciousness, a state where attention is exclusively monopolized by the foreground of life. To restore sanity to our personal lives and to the planet, this relentless fixation on objects must be counterbalanced by the emergence of space consciousness. This represents the next monumental stride in human evolution. Space consciousness is the realization that beneath the constant parade of sensory inputs, mental chatter, and emotional turbulence, there exists an ever-present silent undercurrent of pure awareness. It is the profound capacity to be simultaneously conscious of the events unfolding around you and conscious of the very awareness that is observing them. While this dimension is inherently present within everyone, it remains tragically unacknowledged by most. It is the transcendent spiritual dimension that alone can infuse the material world with authentic meaning, liberating us from the tyranny of the ego and the shallow pursuit of materiality. When exhaustion takes hold, you may temporarily experience a sense of peace simply because the mental machinery is winding down, granting you a brief reprieve from the heavy burden of your conceptual self as you drift towards sleep. Similarly, the consumption of alcohol or certain narcotics can induce a temporary carefree euphoria. These substances artificially suppress the mind's activity, allowing a distorted, fleeting glimpse of the joy of being. However, this relief comes at a devastating cost: the loss of consciousness. Rather than ascending beyond the realm of thought, you have plummeted beneath it, regressing toward a vegetative state. True space consciousness shares with these intoxicated states the quality of existing beyond the grip of thought, but the trajectory is entirely reversed. One is a luminous leap forward in human evolution, the other is a dangerous regression into the primordial shadows. This dynamic is starkly visible in the modern obsession with television. Millions rely on the glowing screen as their primary method of relaxation, willingly surrendering their attention to the shifting images. As you stare at the screen, your own independent thought generation is largely suspended. You are granted a temporary amnesia regarding your personal dilemmas, which the mind interprets as deeply relaxing. Yet this is not the cultivation of conscious inner space. While your mind has ceased producing its own narratives, it is aggressively absorbing the thoughts, values, and images broadcasted by the medium. You enter a highly suggestible hypnotic trance, rendering your psyche incredibly vulnerable to the manipulations of advertisers and ideological engineers. They recognize this passive, receptive state and exploit it to seamlessly implant their concepts into your awareness, effectively thinking your thoughts for you. In this state, you have fallen below thought, sacrificing your conscious presence for a numbing, addictive illusion of peace. The medium itself, particularly programming featuring hyperactive, rapidly shifting imagery,
actively degrades the attention span, rendering true, high-quality engagement with reality impossible. To break this spell, one must consciously tether their attention to the physical body and the rhythm of their breath while watching, deliberately breaking the screen's hypnotic monopoly on perception. The emergence of space between thoughts likely occurs spontaneously in your life, even if you lack the vocabulary to identify it. A consciousness entirely conditioned to grasp at objects finds the concept of space bewildering, as there is no tangible thing to hold on to. If you actively hunt for this inner stillness, as if it were a hidden treasure or a mystical experience to be acquired, you will inevitably fail. It cannot be pinned down, mentally defined, or added to your collection of achievements. However, whenever you experience a moment of unadulterated appreciation for the simple beauty of nature, whenever you find yourself acting with spontaneous, uncalculated kindness toward a stranger, or whenever you feel a subtle, underlying contentment without any external justification, you have momentarily slipped into that sacred inner space. The mental noise has briefly parted, revealing the silent, luminous background of your existence. The philosopher Nietzsche perceptively noted that the most profound happiness is often found in the least thing. This is because a subtle, quiet occurrence, the rustle of leaves, a passing glance, occupies only a fraction of your attention. The vast remainder of your awareness is filled by the unconditioned, unobstructed space of consciousness itself. The object merely acts as a gentle portal into the formless joy of being. This profound truth is beautifully captured in a traditional Zen narrative. A young monk, desperate for intellectual instruction on how to attain enlightenment, hikes in silence alongside his venerable master. Finally, unable to contain his conceptual grasping, he pleads to know the entry point into the state of Zen. The master remains silent for an agonizing duration before suddenly asking if the disciple can hear the faint sound of a distant mountain stream. The young man, whose attention had been entirely consumed by his frantic internal quest for meaning, suddenly ceases his mental noise and strains to listen. As his thoughts subside, a heightened, vibrant alertness takes over, and he finally detects the delicate murmur of the water. Upon affirming this, the master simply points and declares that the sound of the stream is the very entrance to Zen. In that instant of pure, thoughtless listening, the disciple experiences a shattering flash of realization. He comprehends the essence of truth without the heavy interference of intellectual knowing. The ego continually asks how a situation can be manipulated to fulfill its endless needs. True presence, however, greets every moment with a spacious, listening stillness. It merges entirely with the circumstance, allowing the appropriate response, the right action, to emerge organically from the intelligence of the situation itself, entirely devoid of the ego's arrogant desire to claim credit for the outcome. The ordinary human experience is a relentless, exhausting process of immediately naming, analyzing, and judging every single piece of sensory data that enters the field of perception. We are imprisoned by our own relentless commentary. Spiritual awakening demands the cessation of this compulsive labeling, or at the very least, the capacity to observe the labeling mechanism without being absorbed by it. You can cultivate this freedom through a simple, profound practice. Select a mundane object in your vicinity, a cup, a plant, a chair, and direct your complete, unswerving visual attention toward it. Observe its details with intense, quiet curiosity, refusing the mind's desperate urge to categorize its color, evaluate its utility, or associate it with a past memory. Can you simply look, stripping away the filter of the internal narrator? Can you extend this practice to the auditory realm, listening to the ambient sounds of your environment without instantly branding them as pleasant or irritating? As you sustain this relaxed yet piercing alertness, the mental abstractions evaporate, leaving behind a profound, crystalline calm. You have stepped out of the heavy stream of thought and into the luminous expanse of inner space. In the theater of perception, the objects you see, hear, and touch are the experienced. But who is the ultimate subject? Who is the experiencer? If you answer by reciting your name, your occupation, or your biographical data, you remain trapped in the illusion. All those definitions are merely conceptual thoughts. They are objects arising within your awareness, not the awareness itself. You could spend a lifetime accumulating psychological definitions of your character, drastically increasing the complexity of your self-image, yet you would never locate the true subject. The experiencer is the pure, formless consciousness that precedes all sensation and thought. It is the eternal I am. This pure subjectivity cannot be transformed into an object of knowledge. You cannot know it in the way you know a fact, but you can undeniably sense it as your very presence. The tragic error of humanity is becoming so entirely mesmerized by the dramatic content of the experience that the radiant, silent space in which the experience unfolds is completely forgotten. To consciously generate this vital inner space, one must cultivate deliberate gaps in the relentless stream of thought. Focusing attention on the simple, rhythmic mechanism of breathing is one of the most powerful portals available. Being acutely aware of a single inhalation and exhalation is sufficient to create a momentary void in the mental narrative. This practice does not plunge you into a sluggish trance. It elevates you into a state of razor-sharp, vibrant alertness. You cannot simultaneously be deeply aware of your breath and lost in a train of thought. Because the breath is fundamentally formless and subtle, it has historically been synonymous with the concept of spirit, the invisible, animating force of life. Utilizing this formless phenomenon as an anchor drags consciousness out of its obsession with the past and future, forcing it into the vital power of the present moment. This mechanism is equally potent when confronting the heavy, compulsive grip of addiction. An addictive pattern is essentially a parasitic energy field, a sub-personality that periodically hijacks the mind and the physical form. It commandeers the internal voice, constructing incredibly persuasive rationalizations to compel the consumption of a substance or the enactment of a destructive behavior. When this overwhelming urge arises, the intervention is simple yet profound. Pause and take 3 deeply conscious breaths. In that newly created space of awareness, turn your attention directly toward the urge itself. Observe the craving not as a moral failing or a thought, but as a raw, pulsing energy field within the body. By bearing silent witness to the sensation, you shatter the unconscious identification with it. You realize that you are the vast, spacious observer, not the compulsive craving. As this observing presence strengthens, the addictive patterns are starved of the unconsciousness they require to survive, and they inevitably begin to wither. Directing attention into the physical body serves a similar, liberating function. The vast majority of people are entirely severed from the vibrant, animating life force within their own physical form, their awareness trapped entirely in the conceptual realm of the head. This profound disconnection breeds a continuous, low-grade existential unease which individuals desperately attempt to mask through sensory overload, dangerous thrills, or the obsessive pursuit of romantic salvation. By consciously shifting attention to the subtle, tingling aliveness within the hands, the legs, the chest, and the entire internal landscape, one grounds consciousness fiercely in the now. This inner body is not a solid, dense object. It is spacious and luminous. Quantum physics mirrors this profound spiritual truth, revealing that the apparent solidity of physical matter is a perceptual illusion consisting almost entirely of vast, empty space. The physical body is a microcosmic reflection of the unimaginably expansive universe. The vastness of intergalactic space is not out there, it is the very same unmanifested, intelligent emptiness that resides within you. The traditional label for this boundless, generative emptiness is God. By feeling the inner body, the intelligence of the universe becomes conscious of itself through your form, liberating you from the terrifying dependency on external circumstances for your well-being. The rhythm of daily life presents countless fleeting opportunities to slip into this spaciousness. In the fraction of a second before the mind rushes in to interpret a new sight or sound, there exists a pristine gap of pure, alert perception. The frequency and duration of these unlabeled moments determine your capacity to experience genuine joy and your profound interconnectedness with the web of existence. As you honor these gaps, they naturally expand, transforming the mundane world into a vibrant, continuously fresh experience. Inner space is also immediately generated the moment you consciously abandon the ego's desperate, exhausting attempts to inflate its form identity. When you actively choose to drop the compulsion to demand recognition, to broadcast uninvited opinions, to impress others with your acquired status, or to aggressively defend your position in an argument, you dramatically de-emphasize the fragile, conceptual self. To the terrified ego,
This surrender feels like an agonizing death, a terrifying diminishment. In truth, however, by willfully becoming less on the level of form, you create the massive internal clearance necessary for the infinite power of being to surge forward. You lose the heavy, restrictive illusion of yourself to discover the radiant, boundless reality of who you truly are. This is the essence of true stillness. Stillness is not merely the absence of auditory noise, it is the presence of unconditioned space. It is the language of the divine. You are never more deeply, authentically yourself than when you exist in this state of pure, thoughtless awareness. In the depths of stillness, you touch the eternal, formless consciousness that existed before you, assumed this temporary physical avatar, and which will continue to shine brilliantly long after the form has returned to the dust. Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Your Inner Purpose. Once the fundamental requirements of physical survival have been secured, a profound and undeniable hunger for meaning invariably awakens within the human psyche. We frequently find ourselves ensnared in monotonous daily routines, suffocated by chronic stress, or paralyzed by an inescapable sense of boredom, harboring a quiet terror that the true significance of our existence is somehow slipping through our fingers. Many gaze toward the acquisition of wealth and the promise of future independence as the ultimate remedy, only to arrive at those destinations and discover that even material abundance cannot fill the existential void. The quest for purpose is paramount, yet a tragic, almost universal misunderstanding persists. We exhaust ourselves searching for our primary purpose in the external realm of action, desperately trying to figure out what we are supposed to do. However, your most fundamental primary purpose has absolutely nothing to do with external achievements or societal roles. It is intimately and exclusively tied to what you are. It concerns the evolution of your state of consciousness. Life dictates two distinct purposes for every individual: the inner, which is primary and rooted in being, and the outer, which is secondary and rooted in doing. Your inner purpose is entirely universal. It is the shared destiny of all humanity to awaken from the dream of thought. Your outer purpose, conversely, is highly individualized, continuously fluctuating, and subject to the relentless shifts of time. Discovering and living in unshakable alignment with your primary inner purpose is the absolute prerequisite for fulfilling your outer purpose. It is the only true foundation for genuine success. Without this vital internal alignment, you may still manage to amass wealth or achieve status through immense struggle, cunning, and sheer force of will. But such endeavors will be devoid of joy and will invariably culminate in some form of deep-seated suffering. This awakening is not typically a singular, explosive event, but a gradual, profound process wherein the faculty of thinking separates from the space of pure awareness. In the awakened state, the mind ceases to be an autonomous, tyrannical master. It becomes a precise, beautiful, and willing servant to the deeper intelligence of presence. This initiation into awareness is fundamentally an act of grace. It cannot be manufactured, aggressively pursued, or added to the ego's collection of spiritual accomplishments. The ego cannot strive for enlightenment without instantly twisting the concept into yet another badge of superiority to flaunt. If the words of profound spiritual teachings resonate within your core, it is the undeniable sign that this irreversible process of awakening has already ignited within you. Often, this spark first manifests as the sudden, shocking ability to observe your own habitual negative thought patterns without being entirely consumed by them. You realize, perhaps for the first time, that you are the vast, silent space in which the thoughts appear, rather than the relentless thoughts themselves. With this grace comes a profound responsibility. Once you have glimpsed this formless awareness, you are tasked with actively choosing it, inviting presence into the mundane moments of your life, rather than surrendering back to the heavy gravity of involuntary mental noise. As this internal shift deepens, you may experience a profound disorientation regarding your external ambitions. The culturally conditioned drives and material fixations that motivate the unconscious masses suddenly lose their hypnotic grip. You may find yourself residing in a liminal space, feeling profoundly alienated from the madness of the ego-driven world, yet still learning how to integrate this nascent consciousness into your daily actions. As individuals grapple with this profound transition, a desperate longing for significant external change often arises, a yearning to escape trivial employment, to make a monumental difference in the world, and to discover a grand, overarching mission that justifies their existence. Yet, this frantic search for a future source of significance is a clever trap set by the unobserved mind, an entity that operates exclusively within the illusion of time. As long as you remain disconnected from the depth of being, you will seek salvation in the dimension of doing, forever chasing a horizon that recedes as you approach it. Any meaning derived solely from external roles, whether it be achieving career supremacy, rescuing the less fortunate, or even the noble act of raising a family, is inherently temporary and exquisitely vulnerable to the ravages of time. When the children inevitably leave home, when the winning streak abruptly ends, or when the physical body begins to fail, the ego is plunged back into a terrifying void of meaninglessness. This does not render these actions worthless. It simply dictates that they must be tethered to the primary inner purpose to retain any true, enduring vitality. If the primary focus is not rooted in the present state of consciousness, the ego will invariably contaminate the most well-intentioned actions, utilizing them to subtly enhance its own image. The road to suffering is frequently paved with these unconscious good intentions. The fear of mediocrity deeply plagues the transitioning mind, terrified that without a grandiose future goal to strive for, life will amount to nothing more than a series of insignificant tasks. However, true greatness is never an abstraction residing in a hypothetical future. It is found exclusively in the total honoring of the smallest details in the present moment. The present is the singular, narrow conduit to the creative power of the universe. When we mentally reject the present moment, prioritizing a future goal as more important than the step we are taking right now, we sever this vital connection, inviting the toxic energies of stress, anxiety, and frustration into our lives. Consider the natural world, which the great sages frequently point to as our most profound teacher. A delicate sapling pushing through the soil does not experience paralyzing stress about its future as a mighty oak. It does not strive or suffer from ambition. It exists in absolute, unresisting harmony with the totality of life, and thus the infinite intelligence of the universe effortlessly acts through it, guiding its growth to perfection. By aligning entirely with the present moment, the how of your actions undergoes a miraculous transformation. Your behaviors become infused with a quiet, unshakable spiritual power, even if the what you are doing remains entirely mundane. The conventional, egoic metric of success is entirely outcome-dependent, obsessively fixated on future acquisition, public recognition, and the defeat of competitors. The awakened paradigm completely redefines success as the quality of consciousness flowing into the specific action being performed right at this exact second. The end and the means are inextricably unified. If you sacrifice your inner peace and pollute your environment with toxic stress to achieve a future goal, that negative energy fundamentally contaminates the result, perpetuating a karmic cycle of misery that ensures you will never find rest. True success is experienced when the timeless dimension of being permeates the realm of doing. Conversely, to lose oneself is to allow pure consciousness to become completely absorbed by the mental formations of fear, desire, and compulsive reactivity. When the connection to the simple joy of being is severed, the ego frantically seeks futile substitutes in external pleasures, dramatic conflicts, and endless consumption. As the inner purpose of awakening solidifies and takes precedence, its effect on the outer, secondary purpose varies wildly across different lives. For some, the internal shift necessitates a radical, sometimes shocking dismantling of their external reality. Toxic relationships, unfulfilling careers, and restrictive living environments are abandoned, not through agonizing, egoic deliberation, but through the sudden, undeniable clarity of pure awareness. A decision simply arrives, fully formed, emanating from a depth far below the noisy surface of thought. This leap into the unknown often demands navigating a period of profound uncertainty and material insecurity. Yet, when the ego's desperate, suffocating clinging to the illusion of safety is relinquished, uncertainty ceases to be a source of terror and blossoms into a realm of infinite creative potential. Historical observations correctly note that the obsessive desire for absolute safety is the enemy of all noble enterprise. Embracing the vast unknown allows the universe to orchestrate miraculous synchronicities, drawing helpful encounters and unexpected opportunities into your orbit. For others, the external landscape remains entirely unaltered. They continue the same profession, inhabit the same home, and maintain the same relationships, but the underlying motivation for their existence undergoes a radical alchemy. They are no longer driven by the egoic forces of desperate wanting and paralyzing fear. Instead, their actions are dictated by a deep, unwavering alignment with the totality of existence, the interconnected web of the cosmos. The illusion of separateness, sustained only by the mind's compulsive tendency to fragment reality into isolated pieces, dissolves completely. They recognize the profound, unmanifested source that unites all creation. While the natural world operates in a state of beautiful, unconscious unity with this whole, humanity's ultimate destiny is to achieve a state of conscious oneness. When human action is fueled by this conscious alignment with universal intelligence rather than the isolated, fearful ego, the mind itself is redeemed. It ceases to be a tyrannical master and transforms into a magnificent instrument. It becomes a pure channel for divine inspiration and profound enthusiasm, allowing the unparalleled creative power of the universe to flow unhindered through the human form, actively manifesting the architecture of the new earth. Chapter 10. Chapter 10. A New Earth. Scientific observation posits that our universe erupted into existence billions of years ago in an unfathomable explosion, initiating an ongoing process of relentless expansion, diversification, and escalating complexity. Theorists suggest this outward trajectory from singular unity into infinite multiplicity may eventually exhaust itself, reversing into a grand contraction that pulls all of manifestation back into the inconceivable void of the unmanifested source, perhaps to repeat this cosmic breathing in endless cycles. The human intellect struggles to assign a definitive mathematical purpose to this monumental phenomenon. Yet, if we shift our gaze from the external cosmos to our own internal depths, a profound correlation emerges. Because you are a microcosmic reflection of the macrocosmic whole, the dual purpose you possess, an inner and an outer purpose, must necessarily be mirrored in the universe itself. The outward purpose of the cosmos is to playfully generate form and experience the intricate drama of interaction. Its inner purpose is to awaken to its own formless essence. The ultimate reconciliation of these two forces is to channel that pure essence into the dense world of form, thereby transmuting the physical realm. This cosmic alchemy is the task allotted to humanity at this very moment. While human language and conceptual thought inevitably fragment the indivisible wholeness of reality into limited relative truths, much like the way we describe a sunrise from our earthly vantage point, despite knowing the sun simply shines continuously in the absolute expanse of space, we can still utilize these relative concepts to illuminate our path. The expansion and contraction of the universe are not distant abstract events. They are intimately relevant to the narrative of what you call your life, even though your life and life itself are ultimately indistinguishable. The cosmic rhythm of outward manifestation and inward return pulses through every facet of existence, echoing in the steady beating of your heart, the rhythmic flow of your breath, and the alternating cycles of waking and dreamless sleep, where consciousness briefly dips back into the unmanifested source to be replenished. This same dual movement perfectly maps the trajectory of an individual human life. From the unknown void, you emerge into form. Birth initiates a relentless period of expansion, physical maturation, the accumulation of knowledge, the broadening of experience, and the acquisition of possessions and influence. This outward movement is the domain of your secondary outer purpose. It is also the fertile ground where the ego takes root and flourishes, aggressively identifying with these accumulations to solidify its form identity. Unlike the balanced expansions found in nature, the ego's appetite for growth is parasitic and insatiable, entirely lacking an innate mechanism to cease its demands for more. Yet, inevitably, the pendulum swings and the return movement commences. Forms begin to dissolve, loved ones pass away, physical vitality wanes, and the sphere of worldly influence steadily contracts. The ego, terrified of becoming less, reacts to this natural recession with profound anxiety, depression, and desperate clinging. The consciousness that was once entirely absorbed in building and acquiring now faces the setting sun of its own physical form, moving inexorably toward the moment when the chair sits empty, and the individual expression of the universe returns to the silence from whence it came. In our profoundly unconscious contemporary culture, this natural dissolution of form, manifesting as old age, illness, or loss, is viewed exclusively as a tragic failure, a grim mistake in the mechanics of life. Because death has been sanitized, hidden behind the closed doors of nursing homes and masked by cosmetic preparations in funeral parlors, it exists only as a terrifying abstraction. Consequently, when the demolition of their worldly reality begins, individuals are plunged into absolute despair. The meaning they had so painstakingly constructed was entirely dependent on external accumulation and egoic validation. When those structures crumble, nothing makes sense anymore. However, this very collapse harbors the most potent potential for spiritual awakening. The cracking of the ego's shell during the return movement is the traditional portal through which the dimension of spirit enters human experience. Ancient cultures intuitively grasped this alchemy, venerating their elders as vessels of profound depth and wisdom. In stark contrast, a society addicted to the frantic energy of doing views the stillness of old age as uselessness, entirely ignorant of the immense value of pure being. When the outward trajectory is abruptly shattered by premature tragedy, severe disability, or early encounters with death, this forced, early initiation into the dissolving of form can catalyze a profound spiritual maturity. The archetype of the wounded healer or the blind seer speaks to this truth. What is irrevocably lost on the dense level of form is compensated by a vast, compensatory expansion on the level of essence. Those who fully surrender to this return movement, rather than hardening their egoic shells in bitter complaint and fearful resistance, become radiant. Their weakening physical bodies transform into transparent vessels, allowing the pure light of consciousness to shine brilliantly into the world. Historically, the natural outward expansion of human life has been immediately hijacked by the ego, utilized entirely for its own self-aggrandizement through the relentless comparison of more than and less than. However, the unprecedented evolutionary shift occurring today allows a growing multitude to awaken voluntarily, directly in the midst of their outward cycle of growth and creation. They do not require the agonizing catalyst of tragedy or the natural dissolution of old age to initiate the awakening process. When the outward movement is emancipated from the ego's distortion, human intelligence aligns seamlessly with the creative impulse of the universe itself. We must recognize that human intellect, when enslaved by the ego, is capable of staggering, dangerous stupidity, an intelligent madness that can split the atom only to build weapons of mass annihilation. This fragmented, self-serving intelligence is an existential threat to our species. Yet, when cleansed of egoic dysfunction, our actions cease to generate the frictional resistance that inevitably accompanies selfish desire. Awakened creation is inherently inclusive, aiming for the absolute good of the entire interconnected web of life rather than fiercely defending the borders of a single nation, ideology, or species. The realization dawns that action, while necessary, is forever secondary to the state of consciousness from which it emanates. Without a fundamental shift in inner awareness, the most frantic external efforts will only succeed in reconstructing slightly modified versions of the same egoic nightmare. Consciousness itself is eternal, formless, and complete. It does not evolve or abide by the laws of time. Yet when it descends into the manifested universe, it embarks upon a gradual evolutionary journey of self-realization. It spends eons preparing increasingly complex physical forms to serve as conduits for its expression. When pure consciousness enters the dimension of matter, it falls into a profound, hypnotic sleep, temporarily losing its self-awareness by identifying completely with the physical forms it inhabits. In the animal kingdom, this dream of form is absolute, interrupted only by the briefest flash of awakening at the exact moment of physical death, before plunging back into the cycle of reincarnation. The human ego represents the terminal, most dense stage of this universal sleep. The staggering complexity of the human brain, a biological matrix mirroring the vastness of a galaxy, was not the creator of consciousness, but rather a magnificent instrument crafted by consciousness to facilitate its own awakening within the physical dimension. The manifestation of this new evolutionary epoch is awakened doing. Just as a caterpillar reaches a peak of grotesque dysfunction immediately before its miraculous metamorphosis, the human ego is currently flailing in its final, most destructive throes. Awakened doing is the perfect harmonization of your external actions with your primary internal purpose of staying conscious. It represents the realization that the quality of your existence is not dictated by what you are doing, but entirely by how you are doing it, which is solely determined by your state of presence. The action itself becomes secondary. The primary focus is the pure, unobstructed current of consciousness flowing into the activity. This radical reversal of priorities ensures that success is no longer a stressful future objective, but a living reality inherent in the quality of the present moment. True power and genuine success emanate strictly from this field of alert attention, untainted by the desperate grasping of unconscious thought. For this awakened consciousness to flow cleanly into the world of form, every action must be rooted in one of three energetic modalities: acceptance, enjoyment, or enthusiasm. If an action is performed outside of these frequencies, it is undoubtedly contaminated by the ego, actively generating suffering for yourself and the surrounding environment. The first modality, acceptance, is required when you are faced with a necessary task that brings no inherent pleasure. It is the conscious surrender to the demands of the now. Whether it is enduring a tedious chore or navigating a frustrating inconvenience, acceptance dictates that you perform the action willingly and peacefully, abandoning all internal resistance. This profound inner peace is a high-frequency vibration that actively introduces new, conscious energy into the world. If a situation is so intolerable that neither enjoyment nor acceptance is possible, your only responsible choice is to stop the activity entirely, thereby claiming absolute responsibility for your state of consciousness. When the peace of surrendered action is ignited by genuine pleasure, it blossoms into the second modality, enjoyment. In the new earth, the toxic, desperate motivation of wanting, which is rooted in the ego's terrifying delusion of separation and lack, will be entirely replaced by the dynamic power of joy. True joy does not emanate from the external activity itself. It is the natural radiance of your own deep being flowing outward into the action. The belief that a specific object, career, or relationship can make you happy is a dangerous misperception that guarantees a life of continuous frustration. Joy is the feeling of being completely, vibrantly alive in the present moment, untethered from the mind's endless conditions. By taking mundane, everyday routines and performing them with absolute, alert presence, the tediousness evaporates, replaced by the profound, quiet joy of conscious existence. The action simply becomes a transparent vehicle for the light of awareness. The third modality, enthusiasm, ignites when deep enjoyment is coupled with a dynamic vision or a specific goal. This introduces a powerful structural tension into the energy field, propelling your actions with staggering intensity and focus. Unlike the toxic stress generated by the ego, which occurs when the desire to reach the destination eclipses the experience of the journey itself, enthusiasm is completely devoid of strain. It resonates perfectly with the creative, outward-flowing power of the universe. True enthusiasm is never confrontational. It does not require the creation of losers to secure its own victory, nor does it view obstacles as enemies. Because it operates from a place of absolute inner abundance, it seamlessly yields to opposition, turning adversity into assistance. The goals fueled by enthusiasm are dynamic and expansive, focused not on the egoic accumulation of wealth or static status, but on the active enrichment of the whole. You become a hollow flute through which the breath of the universe creates magnificent music. Yet, it is vital to remember that enthusiasm belongs exclusively to the outgoing cycle of creation. When the inevitable return movement of dissolution begins, enthusiasm must be gracefully surrendered, replaced by the profound peace of letting go. Not every awakened individual is destined to manifest this explosive outward movement. While some are called to be dynamic creators, reformers, and visionaries, others naturally gravitate toward a quieter, more inward-focused existence. After the biological expansion of youth, they feel little compulsion to actively mold or conquer the external world. They seek modest, unobtrusive roles, preferring to remain on the periphery of a frantic society they feel no affinity with. In previous eras, these individuals might have retreated to monasteries as contemplatives. In our aggressive, achievement-obsessed modern culture, they often feel entirely out of place. Yet, in the architecture of the new Earth, their function is utterly indispensable. They are the frequency holders. Their profound purpose is to anchor the new consciousness into the planetary grid not through grandiose achievements, but through the pristine quality of their daily mundane interactions and the sheer depth of their unshakable stillness. They infuse the ordinary with the sacred, proving that the silent power of simply being alters the collective human consciousness just as radically as the most sweeping external reforms. To envision this emerging reality is not to indulge in a naive utopian fantasy. Utopian ideologies invariably share a fatal structural flaw. They locate salvation in a projected, idealized future. Seeking deliverance in the future is the ultimate egoic delusion, a desperate attempt to find liberation within the very mental constructs that imprison us. The prophetic vision of a new heaven and a new earth is not a political blueprint for tomorrow. The new heaven is the awakened state of consciousness itself, and the new earth is simply its inevitable physical reflection in the external world. This transformation is not a distant event that will eventually arrive to save humanity. It is a shift that can only occur in the radical immediacy of the present moment. If it is not arising right now, within the stillness of your own being, it remains nothing more than an empty conceptual phantom. The ancient teaching that the meek shall inherit the earth speaks directly to this truth. The meek are the egoless, the awakened souls who have surrendered the illusion of separation and recognized their profound, inextricable oneness with the entirety of creation. They do not conquer the world through force. They transform it by embodying the luminous consciousness that perceives it. This radical, unprecedented species is awakening on the planet at this very moment, and you, in your deepest essence, are it.